All right, hello. Hello and welcome to the 2024 IAPA Honors Conference. My name is Anya Bernstein-Bassett, and I am the Faculty Director of the International and Public Affairs Concentration and Director of Undergraduate Teaching and Learning at the Watson Institute. Together with Claudia Elliott, I have had the privilege of leading one of our two honors seminars this year, with each of us working with half of our students as they developed their topic and method and started to conduct primary and secondary research leading to the theses they are presenting today. It has been a joy to watch these projects develop, to walk with our students as they have steadfastly and tirelessly conducted their research, analyzed their findings, and are now presenting their completed work. Before we hear more about these amazing projects, I'd like to say just a few things. First, about thesis writing during this time. This has been a challenging 4 years for the class of 2024. They started their college experience remotely, barely able to connect with each other, and learning online from unair-conditioned dorms during the summer of 2021. I heard a lot about that over the course of the year. Over the past 4 years, our study of international and public affairs has been characterized by the urgency of the outside world, from the threats of climate catastrophe, violence, racism, pandemic, polarization, and war. As I've said to you individually, when I compare this time to my own time in college, when the Cold War was ending and we actually thought it was going to be the end of history, my heart goes out to you. It is understandable during these times that we might focus on immediately trying to change the outside world. So I believe that it takes a special kind of courage to focus on an academic project trying to deeply understand an economic, political, or social problem, looking at it from multiple perspectives and developing an argument that in some small way adds to what we know and what we understand. And I believe that this work will help you to contribute to the outside world after you graduate. As my friend Gary Shipman says, if you plan to do something about the world, to make it better than when you first found it, you need to know how it actually works. While writing a thesis is a tremendously hard work, it is also an act of curiosity and discovery. I have talked with many of our students about the joy that one feels after many months of slogging through research and the writing process, when you realize that you have an argument, you have evidence to support your argument, and if you keep going, you're going to have a brand new baby thesis. As the American poet Troy Delacroix first wrote, joy is an act of resistance. And as Audre Lorde wrote, the sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers that can be the basis of understanding much of what is not shared between them and lessens the threat of difference. We are here today to celebrate the courage, commitment, and resilience of our students, and we are here today to share their joy and discovery, their contribution to what we know. We are here to use knowledge and understanding to bridge differences, to connect with one another, to remember that as we face this world together, we are all human, all trying to figure out how to live in this world. These students are showing us the way. We are also here to honor advising and care work. Each of these students had at least 2 advisors who walked with them on this journey, guiding them towards the literature they engaged with and coaching them on methods ranging from quantitative study to document analysis to interviews and observations. The job of the advisor is a sacred one, to listen carefully, meet the student where they are, offer advice, and give the student friendly criticism, and to push them sometimes beyond what they think they can do. And each student had a whole team of faculty, staff members, looking at you, Anita and Sandy, friends and family members who listened to woes and celebrated joys, edited, and importantly, fed and brought coffee to hungry and tired thesis writers. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge everyone in this room and watching on YouTube who has been part of our students' thesis journey today. Thank you. Finally, a word to our students, and some of you have heard me say this before. This may not be the end of your thesis process. A few of you may draw from this experience the inspiration to go into academia. That's what happened to me after I finished my thesis. Now 34 years ago, I was very young. But regardless, you may find yourself following the themes of your thesis well into the future. I have had the joy of walking with over 2,000 thesis students in my career and staying in touch with a significant number of them. For some, the connections between what they are doing now and their thesis are obvious. The student who wrote about rural homelessness is now a housing lawyer. The student who wrote about environmentalism in China now works for a clean energy company. For others, the connections are a little less obvious. The student who wrote about how schools communicate in culturally sensitive ways with immigrant parents is now an internal medicine resident at a hospital with many immigrants, applying the ideas she studied as she connects with her patients and their families. The student who wrote about the Israel-Palestine conflict is now a state representative in Illinois with plans to run for Congress and beyond, which he judges to be the most effective way to change American foreign policy. So I wonder, how will the ideas and commitments that you made this year affect you in the future? As you step out into the world, prepared with knowledge, skills, and experiences, how will you use them to contribute to make our world a little better than you first found it? I am so proud of you now, and I am so excited to see who you will become. And now here's how we're going to do this. Each panel runs for 50 minutes with time to move around in between. Each student has exactly 10 minutes to present their theses, and we've told them that we need time to hear each student, so they need to be prepared to use to fit what they have to say into the time they have. Each panel moderator will introduce the students, keep the time, and facilitate our 20-minute Q&A. We invite audience members to ask questions, hopefully spreading them out so that each student will have the opportunity to speak again. Then we'll move on. And at the end, after our 3 panels today, Ed Steinfeld will deliver closing remarks, and we will adjourn to our reception, which you are all invited to. Note, free food. All are welcome to celebrate our students, and we will be giving out honors cords to every student, because every student here has earned honors, and they can wear them on graduation and keep afterwards. So I will now turn the podium over to Professor Susan Moffett, who will moderate the first panel.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I am Susan Moffett. I'm a professor of political science, international and public affairs. It's also my pleasure to serve as director of academic programs here at the Watson Institute. So glad to see you all here in the room or on the Zoom, and my heartiest congratulations to all of our thesis writers today. And I'm delighted to be starting our thesis program with a panel. Reform in America, Education and the Workplace. Each of these theses takes on important issues of human capital, which is foundational to the study and practice of governance. We will start with Emory Brinson's thesis, Silos and the Status Quo, an analysis of state takeover spillover effects in early childhood education. We will then follow with Siri Pierce and her thesis, School Choice, Self-Sorting, and the Pursuit of Equitable Education in Portland, Maine. And we'll follow with Lizzie Bernold and her thesis on career progression of congressional staffers, gender inequity on Capitol Hill. And just a reminder that we will go in order for our thesis. They will each present for 10 minutes, so start writing down your questions for our thesis presenters. Now we will take those questions at the end. So will you join me in welcoming to the podium Emory Brinson.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emery Brinson, and today I'll be speaking on my senior thesis, Silos and Status Quo, an analysis of state takeover-associated spillover effects in the early childhood education and care sector. First, I'd like to thank my primary advisor, Professor Susan Moffett, my secondary reader, Professor Jonathan Collins, and my seminar instructor, Professor Anya Bassett. I'm going to begin by defining the key terms that set the foundation for my thesis. State takeovers refer to an education reform policy that transfers control of a public school district from a local education authority, typically a school board, to a handful of state officials. This is often accompanied by widespread dismissal, changes in curriculum, shifts in policies and priorities. The Providence Public School District has been under state takeover since 2019 and represents a typical case. The early childhood education and care sector refers to the collection of public and private programs that supports children prior to entering kindergarten with educational opportunities. I focus specifically on public pre-kindergarten, which includes state-subsidized programs which particularly support, although not always, low-income students. Participation in pre-kindergarten programming has been linked to improved socio-behavioral and academic outcomes, including improved 8th grade and 3rd grade test scores, improved graduation rates, decreased crime rates, and improved income later in life. The connection between pre-kindergarten participation and K-12 academic outcomes particularly has led me to study spillover effects under education reform policies like state takeovers. Spillover effects occur when a non-targeted or minimally targeted sector experiences positive or negative change under a policy intervention. The central research question for my thesis was, does the publicly funded early childhood education and care sector experience spillover effects, positive or negative, following state takeover of the adjacent school district? And then more specifically, has the state takeover of the Providence Public School District been associated with changes in enrollment in public pre-K, the quality of public pre-K, or the ability of children to gain access to public pre-K? As you can see from this last question, I utilized 3 metrics to define spillover effects throughout my thesis. Enrollment, which is just the number of children participating in a pre-K program. Access, which is the ability of children in low-income or racially diverse communities to participate in pre-K programs, which I define geographically. And then quality, which I define based on the 10 standards identified by the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which many states use to define whether a program is of quality. Answering these questions will allow me to fill a gap in the literature while also contributing to a conversation about how education reforms affect districts as a whole. Moving throughout my thesis, I utilized 3 models of change, which each depict a way that state takeovers may implicate early childhood education and then drive change in the district overall. The first model at the top reflects the ideal model of change, in which state takeovers work as promised, prompting positive change across the district, including positive spillover in the early childhood and education sector. This theory builds on research that has shown positive academic outcomes in districts like Lawrence Public School District. The bottom theory shows kind of the flip side, where you see negative disruption in the district, including negative spillover effects in early childhood education. This theory builds on research that has shown that state takeovers can be disruptive in the academic space for K-12 students, but also disruptive for areas outside of academics, like through Black disempowerment. The third model takes into account the fact that the early childhood education and care sector and public education in the United States developed separately due to stigmas around out-of-home childcare and welfare, among other things. If the status quo remains that K-12 education policymaking and public pre-kindergarten education policymaking occur in separate silos, we may not see any spillovers, positive or negative, in the early childhood education sector. Because of what we know about the impact of pre-kindergarten participation, this may impact the ability for state takeovers to promote positive change across the district. I utilized a mixed methods design for this research. First, I compared public pre-K enrollment in 46 takeover districts and 46 non-takeover districts. And then I compared Rhode Island pre-K center development across time in 4 Rhode Island school districts, Cranston and Pawtucket, which have never been under takeover, and then Providence and Central Falls, which are currently under takeover. I look specifically at the socioeconomic disadvantage, which is a term that discusses the consolidation of poverty and racial diversity of census tracts. And I ended up finding positive spillover and basically a positive association between takeovers and socioeconomic disadvantage and the development of Rhode Island pre-K centers. And then finally, I did a case study of the Providence Public School District and looked at a small group of interviews with administrators and teachers in pre-K centers in Providence. And then I looked at policy making priorities and the metrics that the state uses to guide takeover success. I identified 3 key findings from this analysis. First, I found evidence of positive spillover despite the fact that the systems appear to remain siloed. This map shows socioeconomic disadvantage in Providence along with the Rhode Island pre-K centers, kind of displaying that some of that positive spillover that I was discussing earlier. However, there is little evidence that these pre-K systems and the K-12 systems became more aligned or worked in conjunction to promote cross-sector improvements. Instead, you just see these kind of breakthrough condensed versions of positive spillover. And this may be because this spillover was condensed at the policy level through political reprioritization and restructuring, which was my second finding. This chart at the bottom shows the policy-making bodies in Providence and Greater Rhode Island that make decisions around early childhood and education. And the early education director was a new position developed following the takeover. And this reflects that as state priorities move into the district level of policymaking following the takeover, you may see the introduction of things like early childhood education and care at the district level, and that moves up in the policymaking priority space. However, at the practice level, which if you look at teachers and administrators, that positive spillover did not penetrate down to their level. They still felt that there was silos and a disconnect between pre-K and the K-12 sector, and that this disconnect was allowing for the problems that had pre-existed the takeover to continue on. And they felt that issues with staffing, with curriculum, continued because there was this disconnect between K-12 and pre-K. And so all of that leads into my implications, which kind of show that education policymaking silos persist and challenge district-wide reform efficacy. So state takeovers are promoted as this kind of widespread systemic reform. However, they do not appear to effectively work through adjacent sectors to promote change. And then finally, when considering adjacent sectors and practice level impact, so again, that's thinking about how teachers and administrators are able to implement the policies that are being driven for at the policy level, so at the central office level, state takeover success is complicated. There's evidence of positive spillover, so you see, again, some increased access for low-income communities in particular, but there's also evidence of negative experiences where teachers are having a really hard time implementing new policies. So overall, I was not able to show, state takeovers are really good for early childhood education or they're really bad for early childhood education. However, we do see some room for hope, which is really exciting. State takeovers have traditionally kind of had mixed evidence and often are posed as something that's really can be dangerous or just kind of an all-out failure. But there's clearly room for improvement and for hope. And so I hope that more scholars will look at the kind of adjacent sectors that may be able to improve the overall efficacy of state takeovers, especially when they can have a direct link to the ability of K-12 sectors to work. So thank you very much.
presenter is Siri Pierce, School Choice, Self-Sorting, and the Pursuit of Equitable Education in Portland.
Just get some water first. Thank you all for being here today. I'd first like to thank my incredible team of advisors, Tony Levitas, Andrea Flores, and Anya Bassett. You all have been so wonderful to me in this process, as well as my incredible thesis cohort. The idea for this thesis first emerged at one of the biggest soccer games of the season in my hometown, Portland, Maine. The two public high schools, Portland and Deering, were going head-to-head. But I didn't notice the gameplay, but rather the stark racial imbalance between the teams. Portland High had predominantly white players, while Deering had predominantly players of color. The year that I attended the soccer game, Portland's 9th grade class exceeded Deering's by 127 students. And Portland's class was majority white, 58% were white, and 42% of students were non-white. And Deering was majority students of color, 51% students of color, and 49% white. Witnessing this visible racial disparity between the teams at the soccer game, I set out to investigate the causes behind this imbalance. School choice encompasses a broad number of policies from charter schools to voucher programs. Portland Public Schools has a model of intradistrict public school choice, meaning students can choose which public high school they go to. The ideological concept of school choice emerged in reaction to mandated desegregation efforts after Brown v. Board of Education. White parents in the South wanted to preserve their all-white schools and demanded their educational right to choose the school for their child. Simultaneously, scholars like Milton Friedman envisioned school choice as a mechanism to liberate students, parents, and schools from the inefficient and bureaucratic grip of the government. Parents and students, as educational consumers, would be free to choose the school that they think is best for their child, while generating competition that would incentivize schools to enhance the quality of education they provide for their students. In this thesis, I contribute to a vast body of school choice literature that explores whether school choice can successfully facilitate the formation of diverse schools, or whether it exacerbates it. Portland, Maine is the ideal case to investigate this question. It's a progressive, but historically majority white community. The city didn't begin welcoming refugees and asylum seekers until the 1980s. And today, students in the district, 34% are English language learners. Since Portland does not have the legacy of historical school segregation that exists in most urban school districts, it's not a story of school choice as a failed pathway to integration, but rather school choice as a potential lever of racial self-sorting, even in a community committed to implementing progressive policies and supporting immigrants. This is a photo of an article from 1999 titled "Separate but Not Equal," and it shows how 20 years earlier the reputations of the schools were reversed. Portland went from being the immigrant school to the white school, and Deering went from almost entirely white middle-class school to being the most diverse school in the city and state. While Deering worked to move away from its reputation as the white school towards one of multiculturalism and academic inclusion, attracting more students of color, Portland High, perceived as the lower-performing inner-city school, buckled down on the selling points of tradition and academic rigor, appealing to more white middle-class families. As we can see from the graph, for a brief moment around 2010-2013, these strategies seemed to balance racial and socioeconomic diversity between the schools, but the achievement was short-lived. Their reputations became increasingly racialized in the community, reaching a tipping point in the 2019-2020 school year, which is the year I focus on in my investigation. I used a mixed methods approach to investigate the forces driving this enrollment imbalance. I relied on enrollment data, newspaper archives, and interviews with over 30 administrators, school board members, and students and parents who selected high schools in the 2019-20 school year. From these findings, I argue that families' racial and socioeconomic backgrounds influence their preferences, tastes, and biases, shaping their perceptions of schools and their choice behaviors. Patricia, a pseudonym, I use pseudonyms for all the parents and students, was a white middle-class parent who attended during high school against the trend of her peer white middle-class parents attending Portland High. She reflected, I would say Deering presented an image of we're all one school, we're all in this together, we serve everyone equally. And I'm not sure that's what white middle-class parents wanted. It felt like Portland was more like, we're really academic, we've got the 9th grade team all figured out. Portland was maybe more about academics, and Deering maybe more about equity and inclusion. As we can see from Patricia's observation, white middle-class parents were deterred from Deering's emphasis on equity and inclusion because it signified reduced potential for their children to get ahead. These parents, and some immigrant families, were instead drawn to the values of tradition and rigor that Portland High advertised, such as the number of honors classes and disciplinary approaches, that they considered markers of a good school. While Deering and Portland actually perform quite similarly academically. Parents' interpretations of school quality reflected racialized tastes rather than objective differences between the schools. On the other hand, some immigrant families flocked to Deering, a school community that emphasized academic inclusion and multiculturalism, where they believed they could find greater linguistic, cultural diversity and belonging. The school's increasingly racialized reputation set the stage for 2019-2020, when disciplinary incidents during 8th graders' school visits triggered a spiral of negative rumors imbued with racial bias about the school's climate and safety. Deering, the school with the higher proportion of students of color, became known as the chaotic, dangerous, and wild school, all direct quotes from parents. This is a quote from Christina, a white middle-class parent whose son attended Portland High School but who visited Deering. What Michael remembered was that students were like, this is the smoking bathroom, this is the hallway where fights happen, and so he left, even though he was a very confident and not skittish 8th grader, he left feeling like Deering is scary, it doesn't feel safe to go there. So Deering was really never on his radar, even though we live very close to Deering, and he could have walked quite easily. For students like Michael and parents like Christina, social and racial conditioning shaped their perception of lack of safety at Deering by leading them to easily recall racial stereotypes and inflate the significance of incidents of fighting and drug use during school visits. The white middle-class parents I interviewed valued diversity, but their actions demonstrated concerns over the perceived educational and social risks of sending their children to a more diverse school. The 2019-2020 enrollment imbalance galvanized the Portland School Board to shift their unrestricted choice model to a controlled choice model in 2022 that limited enrollment at each school based on diversity factors. In Chapter 5, I provide specific recommendations for how the district can improve this policy, which I don't have time to go into, but the implications of the Portland case extend far beyond the city itself. Since the civil rights era, schools in the United States have been rapidly resegregating. The fact that Portland schools are not segregated, just and balanced, makes it an even more compelling and consequential narrative of self-sorting. We must understand the precise mechanisms and cognitive biases that drive racial self-sorting, and why even under the best of conditions, a progressive and diversifying city, unrestricted school choice cannot facilitate the formation of diverse schools. Families' in-group favoritism, their preference for the people and settings that look like them, and that mirror their social conditions, and for some, the advantages they know best, still wins out. If parents always want the best for their own children, the aggregate of their choices in a market will not create the schools we want for all of our children. Racially integrated schools nurture social cohesion and democratic values. Portland offers a model, however flawed, of how districts can employ controlled choice to curb the effects of racial self-sorting. policymakers can and should place effective guardrails on choice systems that steer us closer toward the moral and democratic imperative of integrated schools. Thank you.
And now join me in welcoming Lizzie Bernhold. We'll be presenting career progression of congressional staffers, gender inequity on Capitol Hill.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lizzie Bernhold, and I am presenting my thesis today on gender equity for congressional staffers as they go about their careers on Capitol Hill. I'd love to start by, once again, as everyone else has, thanking my lovely advisors, Professor Susan Moffett, who has been instrumental in this journey for me, my second reader, Professor Wendy Schiller, and my thesis seminar instructor, that's the word, Anya Bassett. Congress, as we know it and often think of it, is a leading body for gender equity and employment in the United States. Congress has passed countless landmark pieces of legislation on this topic, including the Equal Pay Act, the Family and Medical Leave Act, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So often in academia and in policymaking, we think of Congress solely for its legislative duties. But Congress in itself has also become a public sector workforce in order to fulfill its constitutional duties. And it has created a very complex labor market within it. Today, every representative and senator in Congress has congressional staffers that back up their duties every day. Staffers are tasked with many of the duties that keep Congress functioning, including crafting legislation, advising their bosses on what votes they should take on the floor, negotiating legislative details between offices, and connecting constituents to federal services. They have a hand in nearly every part of the institution that we know today. Congress frames themselves as a workplace dedicated to ensuring all are free from discrimination. But is this really the case? There are various reports of discrimination that come out of congressional staffers and women in Congress today. Many congresswomen and female staffers have shared stories of being given directions to spouses' events while in the chambers of Congress, completely unprompted advice. Female senior leaders on congressional staff have shared that they feel questioned in their roles by their male colleagues, oftentimes in rooms where they are the only woman present. And there are countless instances documented of sexual harassment and sexual assault. While Congress has imposed many regulations upon other workplaces, the body has done very little to regulate itself. Congress currently only applies 14 laws that they have written to their own workplace out of the countless they have written for the rest of America. And they have limited infrastructure to enforce any of these laws that they have decided to put on themselves. While Congress has imposed many regulations upon other workplaces, the body has done very little to regulate itself. Congressional staffers play an essential role in the functioning of Congress and the passage of legislation, but little research has focused on this group of political actors. If Congress is expected to craft and pass legislation to establish gender equity within the broader American workforce, the institution's ability to establish gender equity within its own workforce should be scrutinized. This brings me to the questions that I have proposed for my thesis. Is there a difference in the career progression of female and male congressional staffers? And if this difference does exist, what does this suggest for gender equity amongst congressional staffers? For my research, I have looked at 3 primary areas of employment that are common within the broader literature on economics and the workplace. These are entry into the congressional workforce. This is not necessarily a person's first job, but rather their first job within Congress itself. Promotions within the workforce. This is someone moving from one job to a job of higher seniority and higher leadership potential. This can happen both within an office and with congressional staffers moving from one congressperson to another congressperson's office. And compensation, which at this point is annual salary. Data for this research was accessed through Legistorm using a grant provided by the Watson Institute. Legistorm is a private company based in Washington, D.C. that aggregates employment data on staffers and members. I focused my analysis specifically on the personal offices of congressional members and their staffers from 2001 to 2022. I ran various sets of regression models to explore each facet of career progression listed here, and I controlled for various demographic and workplace-specific variables. One I would like to call your attention to is the position. This is the job that a staffer held in a specific year. I worked to standardize these position titles across common job duties that were present within each office in order to establish an office hierarchy for use in my analysis. The more senior a position is, the more policymaking power and influence over the office and the institution of Congress someone has. Now, for the results. I ran various regression models to explore each facet of career progression, controlling for various demographic and workplace-specific variables. The specifics: women, as we see here, are 7% more likely to hold administrative entry-level positions as their first job on the Hill when they are compared directly to their male peers. These administrative positions include jobs such as the staff assistant, schedulers, and caseworkers. They handle essential job duties and functions such as handling appearance requests for the members, answering phones, and helping constituents find federal assistance. While this is really important work, these staffers often lack access to policymaking capacities that other more senior staffers have. Men, meanwhile, are more likely to enter the congressional workforce at mid and senior level positions. This includes communications assistants, legislative assistants, legislative directors, and the chief of staff. A gap in men's and women's workforce entry onto the Hill was still present even after stratifying for different educational achievements upon entry into the workforce. From bachelor's degrees to law degrees, women were still more likely to enter administrative positions than their male colleagues. Men were more likely to enter at senior positions when compared directly to women. When we look at promotions, women were 11.3% less likely overall to receive a promotion than their male colleagues while working in personal offices on the Hill. If we take a closer look at between which specific positions these promotions failed to occur, it was specifically when women were attempting to move from entry-level positions to mid-level positions. Not only were women more likely to begin congressional employment at these positions with less access to policymaking power, but once there, they struggled to reach positions possessing this power when compared directly to their male peers. When looking at compensation, I found an average wage gap on the Hill looking across both chambers and all positions of approximately $4,400. This means that women make about 92 cents to the dollar per every dollar that men make on average on the Hill. The pay gap, this is one place where we saw a difference between the Senate and the House. The pay gap was much wider in the Senate than it was in the House. The pay gap was also more persistent in the Senate between positions that have similar job duties than it was in the House. One primary example of this is the chief of staff position, which is the top leader of any congressional office. Women in the Senate were found to make $36,600 less on average than their male colleagues every year. I was pretty convinced it was wrong when I first ran it, so I ran it 3 different ways, and it is in fact the number. There's that. Meanwhile, in the House, there is no statistically significant difference in pay between male and female chiefs of staff. The pay gap is one result, primarily, of the inequities that we see in career progression for workforce entry and for promotions. Men are more likely to possess higher paying senior positions than women, which results in men overall making more on average on Capitol Hill. As we see here, the congressional employment largely reflects the broader inequities of the American workforce that we see today. There are gender differences in the ways women enter the congressional workforce, the ways they are promoted, and the ways they are compensated for their work. As women struggle to gain influence within the institution as they enter at administrative positions with lower capacities for policy influence. As women remain in the congressional workforce, they are less likely to be promoted from administrative to policy-based positions where they have the capacity to influence how the institution runs. A gender pay gap results, in part, because men are more likely to hold these senior positions than women are. This project was largely a knowledge-building endeavor for me to further research and information on the congressional workforce. It is yet to be seen why these specific inequities are currently occurring. There could be institutional barriers in place, such as hiring bias or inflexible working hours that are difficult for working parents to meet. These could also be downstream effects of women's broader treatment in education and the workforce overall, including differences in political ambition due to gendered socialization or the political training that occurs outside of Congress. Regardless, I think it is clear that these differences in career progression should not exist. Congress has the power to fund education or workforce programs to increase women's political ambition or pass policy to make senior positions overall in the workforce more accessible to working parents. Congress also has the power to regulate its own workforce to the same degree it requires the private sector or the executive branch to do so. They currently do not do this. From Aristotle to the Federalist Papers, the foundational texts of American democracy have repeated the necessity of legislative bodies and the government generally to apply the rules they make to their own institutions. Without these regulations in place, gender inequity in the congressional workforce becomes an issue of political legitimacy as Congress continues to pass legislation on gender inequity for the broader American workforce. If there is one body that can currently fix what is happening in Congress, it is Congress. Thank you.
So thank you all. Before I open up the floor to your questions, I would like to start with a question for all three of our panelists. I'm sure you are all relieved the thesis process is over, but imagine that you have one more year starting today. What would you do with that year? Running away is not an option. But the broader point is, where should the research go from here? Knowing what you now know, what would a second year of research look like?
Hi, everyone. Because of some of the education silos that I discussed earlier, and the fact that pre-kindergarten education has only sort of recently, and by recently I mean really the last couple of decades, kind of emerged onto the policymaking, space, or focus, the data has been a little bit difficult to find. So I had a little bit of trouble finding the right amount of data. So you can see my methods was a little bit piecemeal, and I kind of put several things together. So I think if I had another year, I would really focus in on the access mapping. I think finding that positive spillover was really exciting. And so I would move beyond Rhode Island and see if I could find that data in lots of different states where there are takeovers and try to expand that. But I would also do that data collection for the enrollment data and also try and get more interviews for the case study. So more data collection, I think, is where I would go.
I can go next. So I started this project with completely different questions from where I ended. This was originally a mixed method studies. I was going to do empirical interviews with both male and female congressional staffers, specifically looking to explore a sense of belonging within the institution and if this had any impact on turnover results and promotions as well. When I started to do this work, I resulted in a sample size of 1. And that one person was a man. It wasn't a non-response bias, which I found really interesting. It was a lot of people, most people responded to my message to them, but most people said that they would be uncomfortable sharing their experiences and that they were uncertain if there would be repercussions for them doing so, even with confidentiality protections in place. So if there are, however, a limited number, but other works that specifically interview congressional staffers on similar topics, but a little less potential for retribution in them. So if I were to have another year, possibly not as an undergraduate, because I think that was also one of the issues. People were less willing to share that information with someone under the title of a bachelor's thesis rather than a dissertation. If I had another year, I would really want to go back and do that work.
I think one of the questions that I'd set out to answer that I wasn't fully able to answer in my thesis had to do with the year of the 2019-20 enrollment imbalance. There was actually a larger shift of non-white families than white families from Deering to Portland, which I found really fascinating. And I was not able to get a fully representative sample of immigrant families in my study. To answer that question, I held a focus group with language interpreters in the district, which I think helped me surmount the language barrier a little bit. and I talked to them about, they work very closely with a lot of the multilingual families in the district on how they make their educational choices. And one theme that emerged was this idea of education as a pathway to social mobility. And it interested me that white middle-class parents and some immigrant families were both interested in gaining competitive advantages in an education market and were drawn to a school that more heavily advertised values of academic rigor. So I think, and also another concern that came up among the language interpreters that I interviewed was this idea of behavior and good citizenship. I think one of the skills they were looking for a school to possess to instill in their children was this like idea of good citizenship. And so I'm interested in why immigrant families were deterred from the stigma that was attached to Deering. And I would definitely spend more time collecting data among that population of families. And also, I think the educational values varied a lot by ethnic background. So I think it could be really interesting to explore that further in Portland. And also in other places, there's definitely a shortage of literature on how immigrant families navigate school choice systems more generally. So,
Let's take questions. Yes, Professor Brancati.
So I'll ask a question for everyone. Susan stole one of my questions, so I'll reword it a bit. So I feel like I'm karaoke if I do that. And you don't want to hear me sing. I promise you that. So
Oh.
Emery,
I think Zoom needs it. Sorry to.
So Emery, my question is about variation among states. So automatically, in terms of state takeover, I imagine there isn't a straightforward answer because it depends on what state takes over and what they do with their takeover. So could you speak to how the state that you studied is representative in the different ways in which states take over, even if you don't have the data yet on that? My second question is for Siri. As you know, interviews are subjective and you may not have had a representative population. So how would you go about testing the generalizability of the hypotheses that you identified through your very in-depth qualitative study? And then for Lucy, my eyes are
Lizzie.
sorry, I don't have glasses on.
You're good.
Lizzie, thank you. What do you think, I know you gave us a bunch of hypotheses at the end about what might be driving the gap between them. What do you think might be driving the gap between the Senate and the Congress in the Chief of Staff?
Thank you for that question. Absolutely. Heterogeneity between states is something that state takeover research discusses extensively. State takeovers vary extensively by each state in kind of their actual effects. So when you disaggregate data and you look at kind of a broad spread of states, often the effects disappear. So when I did my kind of nationwide enrollment analysis, I found no statistically significant evidence. And so I think part of my findings for Rhode Island were, one, to answer your question about it's being a typical, it represents a typical case in that for Providence specifically, it's majority minority, it's significantly has low income, there are a lot of multilingual learners, so it represents a typical case in that sense. But more generally, lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Heterogeneity. Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Some
Sorry,
characteristics of the Rhode Island. So what does the Rhode Island state takeover look like?
The Rhode Island state takeover, it looks like a lot of states in that it has a commissioner who's come in and taken over the district. She has the ability to basically, she's gotten rid of most of the people who work in the central office. She's kept some people. She's hired new people. But she's developed this set of metrics called the Turnaround Action Plan, and that's how she's guiding the takeover. And that is true for most takeovers. There are things that are specific to Rhode Island. One thing that I write about extensively is Rhode Island has in recent years developed extensive plans about expanding access to pre-kindergarten, which I think was a direct impact on the increase in access to pre-kindergarten, which is one reason why I talk about political restructuring and reprioritization as kind of that mechanism for increased access and positive spillover. It's in some ways it's typical. In other ways, I think specifically for pre-kindergarten, it has very specific. Rhode Island is very specifically focused on pre-kindergarten, and I think that had a very specific effect on why we see spillover there, as opposed to in the grander scheme of enrollment, we didn't see any statistically significant effects.
I think generalizability is a great question, especially since this case study is so case-specific, and Portland really is a unique community in terms of its demographic transformation in the past 40 years. I think what makes the findings more generalizable are the way families, it's grounded in an extensive body of qualitative literature on how white advantaged parents make decisions in choice markets. I think I found a lot of the same behaviors that are present in a lot of other urban contexts where white advantaged parents are navigating choice systems to gain the highest educational credentials for their child and get them ahead in their educational and career paths. So I think that's part of what helps it become more generalizable. But I also think because Portland is what should be an ideal community for choice to facilitate the formation of diverse schools, it is what makes it so pressing for or such a relevant example for other districts, because it shows that even under the best of conditions, where everyone I spoke to was very committed to diverse schools, and they opted into a public school district that is incredibly diverse. So they're already choosing diversity in many ways ways. So the fact that even in a community where so many people were committed to this goal of diverse schools, their choice behaviors still consciously or unconsciously affected, their privileges affected their decision making, I think is what makes it relevant for other cases.
My question was actually, how would you test the hypotheses that you have discovered about their choices?
In terms of generalizability, not the case of Portland itself, but how you came up with a number of different reasons for self-selection. How would you go about testing whether those are actually true, even generalizable within Portland?
The hypotheses within Portland? Well, I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but I think I tested the hypotheses through my inductive coding analysis of all the interviews. I conducted 15 interviews with students and parents, and another 15 with administrators and school board members, and I also analyzed all of the enrollment and data. So all of my findings, all my hypotheses and evidence that supported those hypotheses emerged from that research. I'm still not sure if I'm answering your question.
And we can also take this up during the reception too.
Yeah.
Lots to talk about here.
To repeat your question to make sure I still remember it, you're wondering what may possibly be driving the gap between the House and the Senate and the pay gaps, and then specifically looking at the Chief of Staff position as well? Perfect. Okay, so this gets into the nitty-gritty a little bit. The House and the Senate, if we were to generalize broadly, regulate their employees separately. They have completely different sets of policies when we're talking about workforce entry, when we're talking about hiring, when we're talking about pay. Looking at the House, every House office has the same amount of money given to them every year. And that goes back to the one person, one vote idea that drives districting. There should be, theoretically, we should have close to equal the same amount of people in every House district. Therefore, every House office gets the same amount of money. The Senate gives money to their offices based on a variety of factors, but the driving one is the population of the state. So every Senate office is given a different amount of money. You could kind of think of it, we're talking about education a lot, similar The Senate process is more similar to how we think about school funding, where there's a lot of different factors that go into equation, and that creates how much money the office gets. So looking at those policies more deeply would probably be one area we're going to start hypothesizing about why these differences exist. The House generally, if we look at legislative history, has been more willing to look at staffer experience and legislate around it and make policy around it. For example, in 2022, the House, after this data set was provided, the House set a $45,000 minimum pay floor for all of their staffers. The Senate does not have such a pay floor. The Senate only has a maximum pay, not a minimum pay. So if we were to look at the chief of staff position, specifically, one of my first hypotheses would probably be surrounding bonuses and looking at how the different amounts of money an office is given affects pay. Because theoretically, offices are giving more pay if they have more people because they should have more staff. But no one is requiring them to have more staff. There's no requirements about how many staff members you can have in the Senate. There are in the House. So odds are Senate is giving their chiefs of staff more with the extra money.
Let's take some more questions. Professor Levitas.
Hi. First, thank you. These were all great. It was really good to hear you. And I mean, it's an amazing amount of work that's gone into mapping what you've done. I have kind of two questions. They run a little bit in the opposite direction for Emory. You know, my overall impression of the Rhode Island state takeover is that almost nothing has happened.
Yes, that would be correct. Yes.
So we're talking about a kind of spillover effect from nothing in a funny way, right? So I guess what's your take on the overall nothingness, but what's the mechanism of the spillover? That's really the question I'm interested in.
Absolutely. Yes, so just generally kind of beyond pre-K, the Providence Public School District takeover, especially it started right before COVID-19 hit, which I think has impacted it, although again, takeovers more generally, there's very little evidence that they are effective. Again, there's some that they're effective, some that they're disruptive. Most evidence shows they're kind of neutral policies in the long term. So in Rhode Island or in Providence, I think we've seen a little bit of shifting. I talk extensively in my case study about the changes that we've seen in the Providence Public School District central office, kind of the hub of district leadership. And what we see is that at first you see the general centralization, so the dissolving of the school board that we typically see, and the movement to a very kind of condensed number of people working in the central office. But then we actually see kind of political an expansion of the bureaucracy, which leads to kind of this early education director that I talked about, but also the central office expanded significantly, and I think
a lot of money that they didn't know what
Yes.
to do with, and they hired people, and some of the
Yes.
extra people happened to be in early childhood education.
yes, and I think that is where we see the possibility that sometimes if you have typically early childhood education policymaking is happening at the state level, and so if you now have state officials moving into the district office, that's where you can kind of see spillover happening, even if generally nothing's really happening anywhere else.
I had a question for each.
Oh, sure. Well, we have only 10 more minutes, but we'll start doing a lightning round of questions. So ask your questions, but we'll be
quicker.
lightning.
So maybe I wasn't going to ask this, but now I sort of have to ask it different. Is there possible partisan effects in the wage difference?
Yes.
But-
We already know the answer is yes. So the Democrats, on average, have a smaller pay gap than Republicans in their offices. There is no difference really based on member gender, which I found really interesting. Female members and female chiefs of staff do not necessarily pay their women more. But Democrats have a smaller pay gap. It is still there.
Okay, and Siri, I mean, there's so many rich ironies in your thesis that I know well, but I wondered whether one of the ironies now is that some of the drivers of the disbalance looks to be like self-sorting on both sides, right? That's what the latest enrollment, so the immigrant families are self-sorting one way, and I wondered whether you'd speak to you know, if you have to have a choice market, what you might do to restrain both ends of the stick from self-sorting.
Yeah, that's actually been the district's challenge, as you know. In the first year the policy was enacted, the problem was not white families going to one school, but there was a higher proportion of ELL students. But the way the policy is in place, they can only move students without diversity factors, so ELL, free and reduced lunch, individualized education plan. So the district actually found themselves in having racially imbalanced schools without being able to remedy the problem through the controlled choice policy they set up. So one of my recommendations for the district is implementing more of a universal lottery system that would, instead of the current policy, the way it's set up, rebalances students based on diversity factors. So everyone puts their first choice in, and if there's a racial imbalance, they move students without diversity factors. But a universal lottery that puts minimums but not maximums on the percentages, so they mirror the district's overall demographics in terms of ELL, free and reduced price lunch, and individualized education plans, I think would be more effective. So you can curb the effects of self-sorting both among white families and immigrant families.
I saw a question behind Professor Elliott. Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your wonderful presentations. I have a question for Siri, who, thank you for your research. I loved hearing it. You kind of actually just touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious to know, I know that these were public schools that you were looking at, so I'm not sure how relevant this was to your work, but I'm curious to know if you either found any information on class discrepancies between Portland and Deering, or if you think that that's important research in the future, or if it's not. I'm curious to know why not. But yeah, I think just generally, like, the class aspect of it, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah, definitely. And that was a part of my research. I think I had to trim some of it out for the presentation purposes, but there definitely was a class disparity as well. And it's actually even more dramatic, really, than the racial disparity. Deering in the 2019-2020 school year had a much higher percentage of free and reduced lunch price students, and that persists today. So I think it's interesting to think about how the district moving forward can re-envision its choice policy to account for both the racial and the socioeconomic disparities that exist. I think I definitely would have liked to explore more in the thesis how those issues intersect, but I think that's a great question.
Other questions? Yes, Professor Bassett.
I have a question for Emery about hope. So you and actually also about, oh, sorry, I freaked my nose. So actually, for both Emery and Lizzie, because both of you talked about hope and, you know, what is possible. And, you know, Emery, you talked a little bit about, you know, how could we avoid these silos? How could pre-K education be more centered? And Lizzie, I'm curious about whether we've seen anything over time, 2001 to 2022, that's almost a generation. Congress needs to regulate themselves. How might advocates pressure Congress to do that? So thinking about moving towards positivity.
Okay. I'm being looked at. Hello. So we have two main movements that have already happened where we've seen some regulations be put on Congress. The first is the Congressional Accountability Act of 1995. Those are 11 of the policies that I originally talked about of Congress regulating themselves being placed. The second is 2018, where 3 were added, and this was specifically in the wake of the Me Too movement with sexual harassment. So it was 1995, in fact, but there wasn't a major national movement around it at that time. So sexual harassment and assault has been the primary avenue for which advocates have coalesced around to push Congress to better regulate its staffers. Very little of these policies from 2001 to 2022 had an impact on what we're seeing here. It's pretty consistent across that entire generation, what is happening. So if we're talking about action that is specifically actually going to impact what we're seeing here, if we're looking at Congress regulating itself specifically as that avenue, it becomes like a public agent choice problem, where right now it is too much capital for voters to fully see or understand what's happening here. Workforce entry specifically, this is the first research that's ever been done to look at it, and it's new models for promotion and pay as well. And much of the research, the way it's written on this already, is not accessible to the general public, and it's limited and hard to find. So behind paywalls. So I would start by getting this out there and getting similar research out there more, because there is some of it, and it's not currently being used very often. But it would take a lot of public. Right now, I don't see anything happening soon if we're talking about political feasibility, because if we were to start looking at legislating congressional staffers, the pushback would likely be, why are you focusing on this and not more pressing issues to the entire country? We see that right now when we're talking about raising staffer pay in the House. There's conversations right now getting that exact pushback. So I would love to have hope for the near future, but I think it's going to be a while.
I think we have seen evidence that some state takeovers have been successful. So I think, despite kind of the overwhelming sense that it's mostly a throwaway policy, in places like Lawrence Public School District, there has been evidence that state takeovers can improve a district and can have long-term benefits for school districts. And I think in Lawrence particularly, they talk about cross-sector innovations and the inclusion of pre-kindergarten programs in those innovations. So I think thinking about ways that state takeovers or other district-wide reform policies can think more broadly about what it means, what a district is, and when you kind of start with a district and when a district ends, I think has real progress. Possibilities, thank you. Has real possibilities, and I think the fact that even though it was just in Rhode Island, finding positive spillover in an area that has typically not had positive findings is really exciting. If you can see that in a state that is thinking about pre-kindergarten, that these positive findings can be concentrated into a district through the inclusion of state officials, where we might see that introduction of state officials usually has negative effects. I think that's a really exciting possibility, and something that should be studied further as we think about how we can maybe take state takeovers from being something that is disruptive or negative or just neutral, and maybe think about how we can reframe them into something positive or redesign them entirely so that they can focus on things that are beneficial for the district.
So in our last 2 minutes that remain, I was wondering if each of you could share with us something about your thesis that you loved. Whether that's some piece of research, some finding, the finishing of it, something that you loved about this thesis.
I think surprisingly my favorite part of the research was a part that I wasn't even sure would be a part of it, which was the archival research of digging into the newspapers going back from 1975 to today. I hadn't really done that sort of archival research before. I have a whole chapter dedicated, and I really don't talk about this at all in my presentation, of the history of the integration of immigrants into the city and how the city has transformed, the racial and cultural tensions that emerged, and also how the schools handled the growing population of immigrant students in their classrooms, how they mishandled that. And that was a really fascinating part of my research, was engaging in that sort of archival research and then sort of narrativizing it into more of a creative story, I hope, of how the district has changed in 40 years, which is my hometown. So I learned so much that I didn't even know was there. So that was exciting.
Yes, lightning round. What did you love?
So I, someone who believes that academia can be a personal act, and for me, this thesis was really inspired by my experience having interned both on the Hill and in the State House, and watching the treatment of women in those spaces, specifically staffers in those spaces, and while looking for ways to see my experience reflected in academia, there was very little. And so I'm really excited to be doing work that proves these things are real.
I only did a small number of interviews, but getting to interview teachers and administrators in Providence was an incredible experience, and getting to just give them time to kind of speak about the issues that they were facing, and their hopes and dreams. That was really exciting to me.
And that's a great way to end. Please join me in congratulating Emery, Siri, and Lizzie. Okay, so we are going to do a change of scenery here. And our next panel is Development in Practice, Innovations in Cross-Global Settings.
Hi, Rob. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
I got the 3 students with the hardest to pronounce names. You can find them.
Actually, I just went to the
I'm Rob Blair. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department and the Watson Institute, and I'm very pleased to be moderating our second panel of the day, Development in Practice, Innovations in Cross-Global Settings. We're going to have 3 presentations. We'll just go in the order of what I believe is the order of the program. So we have Akshay Amasur presenting Dose for Development, the Role of Academic Infrastructure and Political Economy in Pharmaceutical Innovation. Gabrielle Shamash presenting Reassessing the Measurement of Cash Transfer Effectiveness, the Life Cycle Framework. And then finally, Annie Schwertfeger presenting Effective Service Providers, Rebel Groups in Complex Emergencies. I was lucky enough to get to advise Annie's thesis, and I'm very eager to hear what Akshay and Gabrielle have to say as well. So I will turn it over to you guys, 10 minutes each.
Roughly 30 people in this room have likely taken a vaccine manufactured in India. Yet likely 0 people in this room have taken a vaccine invented in India. Yes, that was on purpose. But thank you all for bearing with it.
Well, your name while we're doing this.
While roughly 70% of global vaccines and 40% of all generic medications produced in the United States are manufactured in India, India has yet to produce novel pharmaceutical products of its own. This represents a broader global trend. While over 90% of pharmaceuticals are developed in high-income countries, low and middle-income countries produce and distribute the vast majority of these products. Ultimately, this places the entire global population almost wholly reliant on a small subset of countries to create critical breakthroughs that protect human health and safety for us all. Ultimately, this reduces the scope of scientific innovation, reinforces dependent industrialization, and limits research on diseases most prevalent in the developing world. In reaction to this reality, I set out to understand what factors most strongly limit pharmaceutical innovation in low and middle income countries, and more specifically, what factors limit this innovation in India, a critical global innovation market. Ultimately, I hope to understand how generic manufacturing industries in the developing world can transform into innovation-led drivers of development. The significance of this study can be separated into 2 key areas: scholarship and practice. Beginning with scholarship, most research in this area tends to focus on high-income country contexts. As a result, this study fills a critical gap in our understanding and provides one of the first India-China comparisons of innovation policy. At the same time, current research tends to prioritize quantitative research methods over qualitative methods. But when analyzing the human-led factors that influence R&D success, this may miss important lessons. As a result, I leverage primarily qualitative methods for inquiry. Current studies also tend to focus on firm-level factors and their influence on R&D expenditure. Instead, this study assesses national-level factors and their influence on R&D success, rather than raw expenditure alone. Bringing this significance to practice, incentivizing innovation is a challenging and complex topic. This study aims to help support innovation and an innovation-led transition by providing relevant insights to academia, industry, and government. In order to conduct this analysis and analyze broader questions of innovation, I assessed 2 case studies, India and China, from 1970 to 2023. The 2 countries were selected for a wide variety of reasons. First, they represent the 2nd and 3rd largest pharmaceutical industries globally. They're therefore data-rich and globally important. At the same time, China has succeeded in pharmaceutical innovation, while India has yet to do so. This is despite India's strong chemistry base, high gross R&D expenditure, and globally successful pharmaceutical firms. Over the course of this study, India and China also underwent parallel economic transitions and are therefore an apt industrial comparison. In terms of concrete methods of analysis, I focused on stakeholder interviews, conducting 97 interviews across 53 organizations in India, China, and the United States. And with the support of the Watson Institute, I was able to travel to India this January and conduct 48 of these interviews in person across 4 Indian cities and visiting 8 research labs and government facilities. Key interviewees were selected from a group of 4 key stakeholders: government, academia, industry, and finance. They included India's former Secretary of Science and Technology, the Director General of the Ministry of Central Drug Research, the Council of Scientific Industrial Research, as well as the United States Chair of the National Science Foundation, and a wide variety of industry and financial experts. Interviewee testimony was also corroborated through initial readings and examples taken from 17 relevant documents. These included firm and government annual reports, as well as China's 12th and 13th year 5-year development plans. Initial research findings showcase a wide array of innovation barriers across India's ecosystem, which China seems to have largely overcome. Beginning with government, India's low R&D expenditure and limited R&D emphasis have failed to produce a state-led push to drive transitions from generic manufacturing towards innovation. At the same time, the country also struggles from a variety of innovation input barriers. Limited foundational education and large-scale brain drain limit the domestic talent pool, and small resource pools have historically tempered academic institutions' capacity for cutting-edge innovation. At the same time, while India has achieved significant access expansion in education quantity, improvements in education quality have not occurred at the same rate. This led a wide variety of interviewers to note concerns on Indian students' preparation for critical thinking tasks within pharmaceutical sciences. For example, one interviewee stated that India's academic systems, quote, make students overly shy and afraid to ask critical questions, the very questions upon which innovation are founded. Another interviewee stated that, quote, in India, we are trained to be not trained to be scientists, but rather technicians, gathering data. Ultimately, this produces a high and widespread fear of failure among student researchers and mature researchers, which leads to at least the widespread impression of data falsification within pharmaceutical sciences. This reduces industry trust of academic partnerships and limits the translation of research breakthroughs into commercial products. At the same time, academic institutions also view industry with a lack of trust. Several interviewees, for example, described industry as being overtly profit-driven, not understanding relevant science, and cutting corners on quality when it needed to be, despite when needing to have high-quality standards. This produces a dual-sided negative relationship between the two bodies that stymies innovation across India. At the same time, we see a similar relationship developing between industry and financial institutions. Simply put, the generic manufacturing model has been so profitable and so promoted by government policy for several decades that most institutions simply do not consider innovation as critical to their mission. As a result, a wide variety of a lack of success for external-facing innovation projects is taken by financial institutions, both domestically and abroad, as evidence of a lack of capability for Indian innovation. As a result, financial institutions are hesitant to invest into firm R&D projects in India, which further stymies innovation success from firms, creating a secondary negative feedback loop. In contrast to India's negative balances, China has pursued a variety of policy interventions that have accelerated innovation across the life sciences sector, enacting changes into critical innovation inputs, the academia industry and industry finance gaps, as well as promoting long-term innovation investments across these groups. The government of China has successfully spurred innovation within the life sciences. It's also important to note that improved education quality and beneficiary status of foreign technology transfer has further increased the innovation divergence between India and China. At the same time, India, and since 2020, particularly due to post-COVID realities, has pursued a wide variety of innovation policy interventions that promise to put it towards an innovation track. It's important to note, however, that these innovation interventions may face significant challenges in terms of attracting sufficient capital to the sector, in policy implementation, and in the time required to build trust in an otherwise untrusting system. Ultimately, while we see a wide variety of factors influence pharmaceutical innovation in India and China, political economy mitigated factors as well as academic infrastructure seem to be particularly salient. Ultimately, we observe two feedback loops that influence the transition from generic manufacturing towards innovation: an industry academia and industry finance loop. In India, both of these loops are negative, while in China, both of these loops are positive. This is largely due to government intervention. This showcases the critical centrality of government action in order to lead the innovation transition, and showcases that low and middle income countries not only require increased funds for innovation, but also long-term political support and critical capacity building shifts. Ultimately, with current changes in development policy, we may see changes within the overall distribution of innovation globally. And who knows, after a few decades, we may have all taken vaccines developed in the developing world.
Hello. About a year ago, I began the thesis writing process with three main topics: extreme poverty, cash transfers, and measuring the effectiveness of development policy. Quite quickly, these coalesced into a research question and eventually a research design oriented towards the measurement of cash transfer effectiveness using qualitative methods. Cash is very much the future of development policy. Cash transfer programs really took off in the 90s, grew in the 2000s, and we're looking at potentially the third and fourth generation of these programs happening in the current decade and years to come. Cash is very much a broad church development policy, including everything from single grants, universal basic income, to pensions. These are grants and programs that sometimes have conditions attached or take a no-strings approach to their recipients. But despite having an umbrella approach in terms of policy, literature about cash transfers and cash transfer effectiveness is increasingly myopic. It uses an outcome indicator relationship to measure cash transfer effectiveness, almost entirely dependent on quantitative methods. Outcomes include education, health, employment, empowerment, monetary poverty, and savings and assets. These then match with physical indicators, such as school attendance, child birth rate, and total household assets. What's lost in this model, which is increasingly a bit of a false dichotomy, as well as a feedback loop between both ends, is the individual experience of cash transfer programs. What do recipients think, and how do they describe these programs in their own words? So there's increasingly a need for a holistic and more comprehensive approach to understanding cash transfer effectiveness, which was the bigger inspiration and push behind developing the cash transfer lifecycle framework. It's a three-phase approach I used to redefine and reassess the measurement of cash transfer effectiveness. The first phase, the birth of the cash transfer in metaphorical terms, is where transfer policy and transfer variables are decided. This is very much the domain of the policymaker, and what happens here answers the question, what makes a cash transfer effective? The second phase, the life of the cash transfer, is where recipients eventually receive their transfer, decide how they're going to spend it, and ultimately act upon those decisions. This phase, the life of the cash transfer, is where we have best access to recipient motivations, as well as a potential spending mentality around how cash changes people's lives. The death of the cash transfer is where a scholarly autopsy occurs. Here we have researchers looking at the results of physical indicators and assessing, mostly with quantitative methods, how cash is effective. So the creation of this life cycle framework required a theory testing or a theory building qualitative case study for this thesis' empirical findings. This was a case study in which I eventually chose to focus on the work of Give Directly in Kenya, who give large lump sum grants digitally, which is very much the forefront of cash transfer policy. These lump sums are about 2 to 3 times a recipient's annual income given over the course of a few months. Overall, I used a multi-step approach with mainly using in vivo as the software, starting with content analysis to look for word frequencies across nearly 6,000 interviews. These are interviews which were given at the point of enrollment and which all recipients answered 3 questions. What does receiving this money mean to you? What has been your biggest hardship to date? And what is the happiest time of your day? These were questions preset, and therefore research had to occur within the confines of the answers. The results of word frequencies were then the drivers behind discourse analysis, in which I looked at a sample of 102 recipients taken to be both age and occupation, match both the age and occupation spectrum of the wider 6,000 recipients, and look for potential spending mentalities across those interviews. Then there were recipient profiles. Once spending mentalities were found and discussed, you could then look for a recipient which was a typical or an extraordinary recipient in terms of that spending mentality. Recipients, this segment of the empirical chapter, the recipient profiles, includes both images as well as recipients' own words for describing the cash transfer programs. Finally, the application of the spending mentality occurs, and this is where we begin to see the preface to implications to both theory and policy. The biggest finding of this project was the bipartite spending mentality for this case study in Kenya. Recipients balanced the spending of their transfer through short-term relief as well as long-term investment. The typical recipient across the board primarily spent their transfer on housing costs, whether the renovation of severely dilapidated housing or the construction of new housing. Then livestock was often purchased directly to function as an asset to hold value for future needs, be it future years of school fees or the intention to start a business in years to come. Finally, what remained of the cash transfer was spent on current needs, often the payment down of school fee debt, as well as restocking food and any other household needs. Overall, the empirical findings really showed the validity and the utility of the cash transfer life cycle framework, specifically the emphasis on phase 2, the life of the transfer, where recipients can be best understood. Each phase of the life cycle framework shows how effectiveness, cash transfer effectiveness, that is in the eye of the beholder. In phase 1 and phase 3, we see effectiveness primarily defined by either policymakers or researchers, but in phase 2, through the production of a spending mentality and through interviews that are taken at the point of enrollment and potentially in the future afterwards, we see recipients defining effectiveness in their own words. These words show the complexity behind the spending mentality, as both human and non-human factors influenced how recipients chose to spend their cash. Non-human factors include famine, drought, and in this case study, which went from 2020 to 2022, the COVID-19 pandemic. Human factors were often seen in the balancing between individual needs and desires, and the desires and needs of wider families and households which recipients were responsible for. These are factors which best come out in case analysis, specifically using interviews and qualitative case studies. One of the big takeaways for policy is that interviews matter. They should be taken more frequently, they should be taken at enrollment and after, and we should ask recipients of cash transfer programs directly why they spend money the way they do, and we should ask that question again and again to better understand the implications of cash transfer effectiveness. These interviews should be open access and published. I was very lucky to be able to use Give Directly's backlog of interviews, in which I worked from originally 11,000 interviews down to about 6,000. But this is very niche and not not common policy within the development community. As cash transfers increasingly happen digitally rather than in envelopes given directly to recipients, beneficiaries are only a phone call away, and therefore interviews are easier and easier to take. Overall, the spending mentality is not just important for scholars and policymakers interested in cash, but for the wider development community. Recipients and beneficiaries of development policy are going to be spending whatever money they have in complicated, thought-provoking, and well-discussed ways. We should look into those methods, ask recipients directly why they spend cash the way they do, and understanding that relationship will better allow us to understand cash and cash transfer effectiveness across the wider spectrum of development policy. Overall, motivations matter, recipient motivations matter, because if development organizations truly want to empower their recipients and beneficiaries and eventually alleviate and eradicate extreme poverty, their words need to be heard. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I would like to thank my advising team, Professor Blair, Professor Acosta, and Professor Elliott. Thank you all for being here today. In 2022, conflict affected approximately 2 billion people worldwide. That's 1 in 4. Civilian casualties in war are astoundingly high, particularly in civil wars, and these wars are increasing in frequency, length, and scale. Civilians in conflict zones tend to experience decreased income, restricted access to education and healthcare, and higher morbidity and mortality rates. This is because of displaced economies, a persistence of fighting, and the deterioration of the state government. There is, often in the cases of civil wars, an erosion of governmental authority because of conflict. Simultaneously, we know that rebel groups or non-state armed groups party to a civil war often act as a government-like entity, providing services to civilians in regions they control. My thesis, entitled Effective Service Providers, Rebel Groups in Complex Emergencies, begins to untangle the complicated relationship between rebel groups and the civilians living under their territorial control. Within my thesis, I asked the following question: to what extent do rebel groups provide effective social services to civilian populations? And I find that rebel groups can, in certain circumstances, provide effective services despite the presence of conflict and insecurity. To answer my research question, I rely on 2 dominant bodies of literature. The first is rebel governance. There's existing literature that discusses what services rebel groups provide and why they do so. These services can look like infrastructure support, healthcare, education, financial support, security services, and court systems. Scholars in rebel governance argue that rebel groups engage in this behavior oftentimes to gain legitimacy locally, nationally, and internationally, and separately to demonstrate the shortcomings of the existing government. But there's very limited research that systematically studies if those rebel-provided services are effective. My study fits squarely within literature on rebel governance, but I use a critical part of humanitarian aid literature within my methods. This scholarship contributes current understanding of civilian well-being in rebel-held territory. It defines rebel interactions with NGOs, and it provides an underutilized lens through which I assess the efficacy of these provided services. I used the case of the Taliban from 2012 to 2019 in Afghanistan to study this phenomenon. To answer my research question, I employed 2 distinct methods. First, I assessed Taliban provision throughout Afghanistan. I did so by analyzing key informant interviews, existing scholarly literature, and primary sources. This allowed me to triangulate the kind, quality, and extent of services provided by the Taliban. Second, I then measured the effectiveness of those services through fixed effects regression analysis. I used two data sets. The first is a representative public opinion survey conducted from 2006 to 2021 across all districts in Afghanistan. Relevant to my study, however, were over 78,000 respondents, and I used those as a primary part of my data set. My second data set measures Taliban control in each district over all of the years of my study. There are around 407 districts in Afghanistan, and within this second data set, there are three kinds of territorial control. No Taliban control, meaning that the government of Afghanistan has firm control of that district. Contested control, meaning that both the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban are active and often fighting within that district. And third, full Taliban control. I merged the two data sets together to run a fixed effects regression analysis by district and year. Taliban control is the independent variable and is used as a proxy to measure Taliban service provision. And in order to measure the actual services provided, I create indices from the public opinion data set as my outcome or dependent variable. These indices are based on questions including improved perceptions of services and access to services. I used fixed effects regression analysis to eliminate all time invariant confounders and removed unobserved heterogeneity between districts. That is essential to my study for making any kind of causal inference. So after this two-step analysis, what did I find? Following the first triangulation methodology, I created this landscape of Taliban-provided social services. In districts with Taliban influence that are contested or completely controlled, the Taliban influence justice services, security services, electricity access, and education. I also found that the Taliban influenced healthcare in contested districts as well. This slide represents the findings from my fixed effects models. When a district switches from government to contested control, perceptions of justice, health, and electricity are all predicted to improve. At the same time, perceptions of corruption are predicted to worsen. When a district switches from government control to full Taliban control, electricity access is predicted to improve, and personal security and familial security are expected to worsen. All of these results are statistically significant or highly statistically significant, except for justice perceptions, that is only marginally statistically significant. And all gray boxes indicate that there is no observed relationship between a change in territorial control and the corresponding index measuring that provided service. My point is this: the Taliban can provide, in some instances, effective social services. Future studies on civilian welfare in civil war must understand non-state armed groups as having the capability of providing effective services. Assessing the impact of systems of rebel governance, civil war, and governance more broadly on civilian populations requires recentering civilians in theoretical debates. Second, there are also practical implications from my study for humanitarian and development organizations. For these organizations with limited resources that operate in rebel-controlled territory, it is essential to understand what effective services a civilian population may already be receiving. My study directly contributes to that understanding. Third, my study is unique in its systematic measurement of welfare of civilians in rebel-held territories. I offer a quantitative model that can be used to assess the impact of rebel service provision, and future studies should implement rigorous, systematic analysis of these services. Fourth, and finally, the broader implications of these findings may be applied to other cases of protracted conflicts and civil wars, where a non-state armed group is present and is providing services to civilians. The phenomenon of rebel governance is not unique to Afghanistan. It has occurred across the globe in places like Colombia, Egypt, Indonesia, Lebanon, and Sri Lanka, just to name a few. Protracted civil wars generate insecurity and vulnerability for civilians, and a fluctuation in territorial control and constant fighting imperils civilian health and well-being. There is indeed a need for a more critical approach to the study of civilian well-being amidst conflict. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys. That was great. So we're going to open it up now to Q&A. We have about 20 minutes, a little less than 20 minutes. So you guys can address questions to one of the three speakers or all three of them if you have a question for everyone. Let's open up the floor. Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes, we have mics for you as well.
So I have something for all three. For Akshay, it's really just a comment, not a question. I was listening to you and I was thinking, boy, I would have loved to have had him in my senior seminar on science and technology policy in the Global South. So since I didn't, what I'll say is, should you decide to continue this work and this research, please send back to me whatever you write up so that it could be assigned in future. Because I think you're really on to something.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you to say.
And for Gabrielle, one of the most impressive parts of your thesis when I was reading it was that you set out, and this is not necessarily a research question, but you set out with a purpose. You said you wanted to humanize how this matter was studied. And I think that the profiles that I read were really successful in doing that. What I'd want to know is, having done this, the research, and developed the framework, in what way would the things that you learned from the framework, particularly by focusing on the life living phase, how would that feed back ideally into the first phase, the birth, where the policymakers are, deciding what the question should be, deciding who the actors are, and deciding what the answers will be? And then for Annie, I was really curious in looking at the final the chart. I was expecting education to show something, specifically when we think about educating girls and women. So I'd just like you to explain the phenomenon.
Thank you so much for that question and for your wonderful guidance this year. I think when we think about the life cycle framework, or when I think about the life cycle framework, it's important that sort of the bottom arrow, the sense that new programs begin after a program ends, and we increasingly see this as cash becomes more and more mainstream. I would personally like to see discussions of recipients being included in transfer design, and the interviews I was working with were at the point of enrollment, but interviews being taken during a transfer, after a transfer, and then 5 to 10 years to come, which are increasingly possible. And the organization that I was studying will be conducting in the future, are an important way that policymakers can really understand how recipients experience these programs when they're designing new ones. So I think the potential to take sort of interviews in phase 3 and in the years after a transfer is a key way to bring the recipient's own words into the designing of new programs. And I'd like policymakers, whether they're in specifically working on cash transfers or simply working on broader development policy, to consider the power of interviews, not just in sort of their introduction and conclusion to reports, but as important data to assess effectiveness of all development policy.
Thank you so much for your question. In terms of the Taliban and education, we know that the Taliban severely restricts education, particularly to girls, after the point of 6th grade. Often in schools, they put up curtains to separate education, and they take attendance. So a lot of what happens when I say that the Taliban influences education, I mean that they they take attendance of students and both instructors, teachers, to make sure that both students and instructors are showing up to class. Now, the curriculum is obviously designed by the Taliban and has heavy influences from Sharia law and from Islam. And so that's kind of the first part about it, what it looks like for the Taliban to have influence on education systems. And the main part of that is the restriction of access to education of girls. Now, I also was surprised to not find any result on education, but the questions within my index are related specifically to access to education more generally, and perceptions of that education. So the answer is I'm not really sure, and I think it requires further research to kind of build a more cohesive answer to that, because I know that those, education, the Taliban, and effectiveness are all really important things to layer on top of each other.
Other questions? Yeah.
Questions for each of you, really great stuff. I'll try and make it quick, starting with Annie. If I understood you correctly, I was sort of expecting a different conclusion from that chart, and the conclusion that I expected is yeah, it looks like they provide services in contested areas, and then they stop when they fully control them. And you want, so that's my question for you. And Gabriel, did I understand that? In some ways, the enrollment interviews show a kind of very rational hierarchy of spending desires, right? From health, housing and schooling to livestock, a clear investment to food if we need it, right? Is the idea of the follow-on studies to see whether that's actually maintained in practice, or do we know that already? And then for Akshay, there's really is what you're describing true? Two questions. Is what you're describing true for all high-end innovation, or is it different, for instance, in electronics or computer science or space? And then if I heard you right, you sort of leaned in on the overall education system of India being not promoting critical thinking, but I'm not sure that China is known for that either. So is this really a story about the background education systems, or is it really a story about the government being able to selectively pump prime the infrastructure in different innovation areas?
I guess I can begin. Thank you for your question. This is a hard case. It is unexpected, and it was really hard to find information on what services the Taliban provided and where. They are not known to provide services beyond their court system. So that's kind of the first point, is that it was unexpected to find anything. Correct. But I will say that it was especially surprising to find no impact on justice systems. Now, I have a series of hypotheses about why that may be, but I think to answer your question is that this is a hard case, and the Taliban is not known for its robust service provision like we see in other cases of non-state armed groups.
Again, a really wonderful question. You're absolutely right. There is a relatively rational, spending mentality. I describe it as bipartite because, of course, it's balancing short and long term, as well as purchases that are either immediate relief or investment, which can be either short or long term. The purpose of follow-up interviews is very much to see whether initial plans are fully acted upon, or whether variables such as the pandemic, or in the case of Kenya, it was very much in drought, and unfortunately large parts of it were approaching famine during the case study period. So follow-up interviews really allow you to assess what allows or stops recipients from acting on their initial or secondary spending mentalities and spending plans.
Thank you again for the question. So beginning with the first end about whether or not this is translatable to all high-end innovation, the answer, I think, is simply that we don't know. Definitely further research would need to be done. This study was very sectoral specific as well as context specific. So in order to make any sort of generalizable claims, we'd simply need more information. And then your second part of the question as to whether this is a story of real academic critical thinking or simply priming, I think is a great point and something I thought a lot about. In terms of raw test scores, current data seems to show that at an aggregate level, Chinese students at the university and master's level do seem to score higher on critical thinking tasks. However, that data as well is somewhat questionable. And China being used as a shadow comparison in this case study definitely precludes any sort of generalizable statement of comparison between education success in the two countries.
Other questions?
Thank you all for really very engaging research and wonderful presentations. So that's my first comment for all of the of you. I have a question for you, Akshay. So you mentioned that you described the two feedback loops to migrate from generic manufacturing capabilities to R&D or innovation, if I understood correctly, in developing countries. And you suggest towards the end that government intervention is critical to R&D in developing countries. So I wonder if you have thought or you have any speculative comments or findings about through which channels that government intervention can be successful.
Yeah, so great question, and thank you for that as well. That was actually at the end of my study, one of the areas I identified for further research is simply needing more study as to how government policy should be implemented as well as where it should be implemented. Currently, it seems that initial steps taken by the government of India do seem to be having significant effects. So we can see post-COVID, actually, there's kind of been a rise in innovation mindset shift that does seem to be occurring through a central-led state push. That currently seems to be more on the organizational behavior side of things. So there seems to be potentially less action being done in terms of actual financial incentives for innovation. However, certain schemes such as the PRIP scheme being rolled out, as well as the national education policy, do seem to have potential promise to make those interventions. But simply put, again, I think more research needs to be done in that area, both within India and in a cross-comparative context.
So I'm actually going to exploit my moderator's privilege here, since I had a question for you, Akshay, that builds, I think, directly on that one, but I'll also have questions for Gabrielle and Annie. So I was wondering, it seems like sort of a natural follow-up question to your study is, if government intervention is like the key variable here that explains different outcomes in these two cases, we'd probably want to know, why did the Chinese government invest in these sectors in a way that the Indian government didn't, right? So what explains sort of the presence or absence of that government intervention? And I'm just wondering if your research shed any light on that question. Gabrielle, I was wondering, so there's an interesting phenomenon in some of these unconditional cash transfers where people who receive them will sort of make them more conditional. Those sort of opt into conditionality. So, for example, a lot of households in contexts where I work, they will set aside a part of their cash transfer and put it into a sort of a mutual savings group. Like a bunch of people in the same village will pool money and put it in a savings group, essentially tying their own hands to prevent them from spending the money right on the spot. And that, I think, speaks to the sort of interesting debate about, the wisdom of unconditionality. And I wonder if in your interviews, you found sort of evidence of that phenomenon at work, but also sort of more broadly, if your interviews spoke to the sort of, the usefulness of conditionality or unconditionality. And then finally, Annie, a question for you. So, fixed effects are really great because now I'm going to ask you a methodological question that's going to probably really annoy you. Fixed effects are great because they can net out all of those time invariant confounders. I wonder, what is the confounder that keeps you up at night? The thing that that could be driving both Taliban control and civilian welfare that you just couldn't measure and you really wish you could have it in there.
All right, so I can start off with this. Thank you again for another wonderful question. I think another answer, not to repeat, but we require further research in this area. However, initial findings from the study do indicate that competition has really been behind this innovation-led drive. So it seems that innovation has particularly picked up in China since the 1990s, and particularly as well in a second spike in the 2010s. And that really seems to be driven by a centralized state desire to have innovation sort of being a kind of a hallmark of the Chinese state in terms of competition with foreign powers. And we're seeing a similar thing as well reflected in India. So in recent years, there's been kind of increased calls and discussion around innovation pushes. And a lot of that seems to be, at least through interview data, driven by this desire to have India be viewed as an innovator on the global stage. And comparatively, outside of the context of the case study itself, it appears that similar behavior is evidenced in high-income country innovators such as the United States.
Yeah, thank you. You've asked a really fantastic question. And, rotating savings groups are something that I think surprised a lot of Western scholars when they first began to understand why they were occurring. Overall, I think unconditionality is particularly important for lump sum transfers because you're looking at a life-changing amount of money that's coming in all at once or potentially in 2 to 3 payments depending on how your program works. So I found that people were often putting things into savings and investments, but putting them into quite liquid ones through the purchasing of livestock or in some cases the purchasing of land. You were looking at something which could be quickly sold or quickly if you're intending to sell eggs or sell milk and you now need to consume that yourself, the purchase of livestock as an investment I found really interesting because it had a liquidity that a rotating savings group doesn't. Obviously that money is in the hands of somebody else until it's your turn in terms of week or month. So I think there's a real scope in terms of how people may make their transfer less conditional than we imagine, but fundamentally spending that transfer in the way someone sees fit is ultimately the right of all recipients in unconditional programs, and I think that is something people should embrace if they so see it.
Thank you for your question. I would definitely say local fighters. So the Taliban is highly structured, but kind of receives guidance from a few people who sit on a governing council. But at the same time, there are a lot of local fighters who come from local communities and engage only in those communities. And I have been left kind of grappling with what to do about those local fighters, that in some districts, they're engaging with the community, they know the people who are there, and in other districts, they're foreign. They've never been there before, they don't know anyone who lives there, and they have no family or any connections to that territory or that town or community. So my answer would definitely be the local relationships between low-level Taliban members and fighters and the villages or communities in which they operate.
Great. I think we have time for one more lightning round question. Yeah.
Quick question for Annie. So I'm really curious about corruption. I'm curious about corruption. So the finding that when the Taliban has partial control, the perception of corruption decreasing, and the idea that might be a reason why folks begin to support the Taliban and that then kind of evening out. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about how that might be perceived in the local population and how that might affect the capacity of the Taliban to maintain control.
So just to be clear about a result, the downward arrow was a negative relationship, so it was a worsening in perceptions of corruption. So perceptions of corruption were, sorry for that unclear explanation, but when the Taliban took over, perceptions of corruption worsened. So that was an index that measured people's perceptions of corruption in daily life and perceptions of corruption in the country as a whole.
Go on.
We might have time for one more quick question, if anybody has a last. Brian, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This question is for Akshay. I just wonder very quickly if we could put your study in the current political context. And so I'm wondering, how will the continuance of Modi in power, assuming that's true, affect any of the elements on your chart, education and others in your feedback loops, as far as you can, as far as R&D in pharma is concerned?
Yeah. So thank you for your question. I think current government structures have made significant investments into that innovation shift, and it seems to be a significant priority, at least currently, and moving forward for the administration. Especially, we see that evidence through the National Education Policy rolled out in 2020 to make some of those initial input innovation shifts, as well as we're seeing a generational kind of mindset that's being driven as well by government intervention. So it seems that kind of long-term continued political support would promote innovation overall. But of course, as we see, governments change policy, and a wide variety of factors are at play here. So it's not clear necessarily how one administration might fare over another administration moving forward, especially in such a multifaceted issue in international context.
All right, let's give one more round of applause for our presenters. Great work, guys.
Good job, you guys. So
All right, everyone, we're going to get started a couple minutes early. So I'm Anya Bassett, the faculty director of IAPA, and it has been a delight to particularly advise these three young folks who were all in my senior seminar, so to see how these have come out. I'll do the same thing. We will introduce them, and I'm just realizing I need your titles. So I'm going to introduce you in order. And then at the end of each of your presentations, I will ask you the baton question that I sent you yesterday. So you should be ready for it. We, at academia, I think of it as a relay race where previous academics run with a baton for a little while, and then our thesis students pick up the baton and run with it, and then they pass it off to the next scholar, who might be them in a PhD program, or might be someone else. And so I'll ask you, where will you pass the baton next? So you can think about that. So our panel this afternoon, our third best of the three, or not best, but an awesome panel, sorry.
I'd say best, no offense.
All right. We're just not going to go there, okay? So, a great panel, a great grand finale, that's what I meant to say. Interest, advocacy, and political change in the United States. Our first speaker is Logan Danker, Zoning for Climate Change, Understanding Climate Interest Group Engagement in State-Level Zoning Reforms. Our second speaker is Ethan Minkoff, Defense Policy Warfare, Comparing the Introduction and Impact of Contention Around Social Issues on the Fiscal 1994 and Fiscal 2024 National Defense Authorization Acts. And Will Forrest, did I pronounce your name right? No, what? Voorhees, excuse me. I think I would know that. I'm terrible with names. The Politics of Addiction and Recovery in Rhode Island, a legislative analysis of the Harm Reduction Center pilot program of 2021. So, Logan, we're going to swap out name tags.
Panel 2 or day 1 presentation? Yes. Here? There we go. Great. Okay, hello everyone. First I'd like to start off by thanking my advisors, Professor Jeff Colgan and Professor Eric Potashnik, as well as the senior seminar leader, Professor Anya Bassett. My thesis is entitled Zoning for Climate Change, Understanding Climate Interest Group Engagement in State-Level Zoning Reforms. So to start with my research questions, first I was interested in exploring under what conditions do pro-climate interest groups participate in debates around exclusionary zoning reform. And in my thesis, I consider exclusionary zoning reform to be bills that aim to abolish single-family zoning or transit-oriented development kinds of zoning, which are types of zoning that allow denser housing around transit hubs in particular. So reforms that aim at doing those things. And my second question is, why do climate interest groups why does climate interest group engagement vary across bills? So why do some groups support some bills while opposing others or deciding to take no stance in other situations? And why is it important to answer these questions? So first, there is an emerging set of literature that talks about how these exclusionary zoning reforms can be beneficial to climate change mitigation. Namely, they do so by increasing housing density, which reduces vehicle dependence because people have to travel less distances to where they live or to where they work. And because they rely on vehicles less, or they're able to use public transit more, in the case of transit-oriented development, their household carbon footprint decreases, which lowers the amount of greenhouse gas emissions of each household. The estimates vary, anywhere from a 3% emissions reduction in overall transportation emissions up to 17% reduction in overall transit emissions. And transportation accounts for 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, so certainly a measurable decrease, but by no means an end-all be-all solution to emissions reduction. There's also a robust amount of literature talking about how exclusionary zoning exacerbates the housing crisis. So zoning that requires low-density living creates artificial constraints on housing supply. And because of these constraints, we're positioned now where over half of renters in the United States are cost burdened, meaning they pay more than 30% of their monthly income towards rent. And home ownership gaps between white owners and black owners is higher than it was in 1960 and is only poised to go up. Further, in terms of creating new housing, the existing demand for housing outpaces supply, and the growth of new households outpaces the new construction. So the gap between supply and demand of housing is only poised to increase in the years to come. And lastly, these questions are important because zoning has linked climate and housing from the very beginning. Exclusionary zoning, namely single-family zoning, was started in Berkeley, California in the early 20th century by a real estate developer named Duncan McDuffie. He was concerned about a black business that was trying to open up in a neighboring residential area, and he was concerned that that would impact housing prices in his community. So he lobbied the Berkeley City Council to pass single-family zoning to prevent this black-owned business from moving into the community. He was also a longtime president of the Sierra Club and a lifelong conservationist. And many conservationists throughout history has been linked to many individuals who espouse racist views about eugenics that has been very harmful. So it's incumbent for climate interest groups like the Sierra Club to recognize that past and also recognize the benefits that zoning can have in addressing some of those historic ills. So now jumping into my variables and my kind of research design. So in terms of independent variables, I selected organizational fit and environmental carve-outs. Environmental carve-outs are rather straightforward. They're provisions in a bill that try and make development easier by allowing developers to circumvent certain environmental requirements. And it's certainly understandable that many climate interest groups may view these carve-outs as harmful, and that might be a motivator in why they might oppose some of these legislative reforms. Organizational fit is a bit more complex, but I simply define that as the degree of a climate interest group's fit for engaging in these kinds of bills. And I define that in a couple of different ways. First, the degree of an interest group's ideological intersectionality. Do these groups care about intersectional issues like environmental justice or economic inequality, or are they purely focused on things like environmental preservation or emissions reductions? Another aspect of organizational fit is an organization's resources. So the number of members that a group has and the amount of financial resources they have. And that's important because climate interest groups, their primary objective should be climate focused. And it's really only the largest organizations that have the capacity to branch out in more kind of intersectional forms of policy, things like zoning, things that are not squarely climate bills. And I also set up an alternative explanation, which was climate benefits. So is a bill's actual strength or actual likelihood of increasing housing density and subsequently decreasing emissions, is the bill's likelihood to do that a motivator for climate interest groups? Or do they kind of treat all of these bills the same regardless of how their mechanisms are laid out? And obviously the dependent variable I'm looking at is the degree of climate interest group engagement. And in constructing my research, I picked 4 cases. Massachusetts and Connecticut, which considered transit-oriented development bills, aimed to increase housing density around transit stops. The bill in Massachusetts passed, while the bill in Connecticut did not. And then in Oregon, they recently passed a ban on single-family zoning, making it essentially illegal for municipalities to only allow single-family homes in their cities. And California considered a transit-oriented development bill, SB 827, and ultimately didn't pass that, but did pass SB 9, which was a similar abolition on single-family zoning. And in terms of the interest groups that I looked at, I observed the Sierra Club, the League of Conservation Voters, the National Resources Defense Council, and Environment America. These are some of the largest and most well-established climate interest groups in the country, and they also have a presence in each of the 4 states that I was considering, which was obviously important. And in terms of my ultimate findings, so in terms of determining whether or not an organization would engage at all on any of these bills, it seemed to be that an organization's fit was had the most positive correlation with their engagement. So the organizations that are the most well-resourced, have the most members, and are also the most ideologically intersectional are those that engage on these kinds of bills. And in terms of the variable with the strongest correlation to the kind of support, or kind of engagement, whether that's support or opposition, carve-outs seem to be the variable most associated with that. So in the absence of environmental carve-outs from these bills, organizations with a strong organizational fit were apt to support them. And when these carve-outs were present, some organizations might oppose, but others still might support. So in that sense, environmental carve-outs are a necessary condition for opposition, but they're by no means a sufficient one. And organizations can still support these bills even in the presence of some of these carve-outs. And there's also a chart here in the bottom left, or bottom right, that looks at the kind of organizational fit of each organization that I looked at, as well as the number of bills that they engaged on. And as we can see here, the organization with the greatest degree of ideological intersectionality, as well as relatively high degree of resources and membership, the Sierra Club was the most actively involved in these policy debates, whereas organizations that were less ideologically intersectional, like the NRDC, only engaged on 1 bill. And organizations that were significantly less resourced, because the League of Conservation Voters and Environment America have less than half of the revenue of the Sierra Club and the NRDC, generally engage less. But as we can see, intersectionality can promote engagement with groups like the LCV, even though they're not particularly well-resourced compared to their peers. One noticeable outlier is Environment America, which, despite having the kind of lowest organizational fit, still engaged on 2 of the bills. And I think further research should explore this particular anomaly, because in many instances they were engaging on the bill in coalition with other groups like the NRDC, and have also in interviews with them have stated that they do not engage on these kinds of policies. And that's something that I found with other organizations as well, that they state that they do not engage in this kind of policymaking, but nevertheless, you can see them testifying for these kinds of bills. So I think future research should kind of unpack this anomaly, in particular with Environment America, as well as some of the mismatches between what organizations state that they do versus what they actually engage on. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before beginning, I'd like to thank my advisors, Professors Richard Ehrenberg, Dave Pilati, and Anya Bassett for your guidance throughout this project. And as is custom in my family, I'd like to thank Mom. I wrote my thesis on the impact of political polarization on the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. More specifically, I analyzed how contentious social issues were introduced into the fiscal year 1994 NDAA and the 2024 NDAA, and to what extent they disrupted each defense authorization process. My passion for American national defense policy started with frequent trips to the Lexington Battle Green and the Old North Bridge in Concord with my late father, and has continued through a congressional internship this past January. I pursued this project to better understand why U.S. national defense legislation has become subject to greater controversy in recent memory. The NDAA lays out the policies and expenditures for the Department of Defense, or DoD. The bill does not actually appropriate funds to the DoD, but rather gives the legal authorization for the appropriations bill to be enacted. It has become the primary mechanism by which Congress directs defense priorities. The NDAA stands as one of the last remaining legislative processes that closely resembles Schoolhouse Rock's model of how a bill becomes a law. The defense authorization process follows 5 key steps: the President sending their defense budget request to Congress, hearings and markups conducted by the Armed Services Committees, initial consideration by both the House and the Senate, a conference committee that reconciles any differences between the bills, and debate and passage of the conference-reported NDAA by the year's end. The NDAA has been enacted for 63 consecutive years, showing a historic bipartisanship towards defense policy issues. However, there have been specific instances since 1962 when the NDAA has been the subject of controversy, especially around social issues. Most notably, members of Congress wrestled with challenges to the DoD's longstanding ban on sexual minorities during the fiscal 1994 NDAA, while the 2024 bill attracted spirited debates surrounding the DoD's abortion policy. With bipartisanship generally being the rule of defense policymaking, and contention being the exception, it begs further discussion as to why these controversial social issues penetrated the NDAA, and to what extent they impacted the bill's journey in the 2 cases. My thesis asks 2 questions. First, what factors led to domestic social issues being inserted to and created contention surrounding the defense authorization process for both fiscal year 1994 and 2024? And second, to what extent did the contention generated by the introduction of domestic social issues impact the progression of the NDAA through the Armed Services Committees and Congress during the 1994 and 2024 processes? This thesis utilizes a historical process tracing approach. Historical process tracing allows scholars to draw inferences on the basis of causal mechanisms within a case and compare outcomes of similar cases. This approach enabled this thesis to tell the stories of the relevant legislative processes, derive causal inferences within each case, and draw generalities and differences when comparing the 2 cases. I relied on a range of different sources in order to triangulate my findings. The primary sources I consulted were congressional hearings and debates, legislation, opinion articles, tweets, statements, and reports, while my secondary sources included legislative history, scholarly analysis, books, and commentaries. This thesis uses the introduction of divisive social issues into the NDAA as a mechanism through which contention can be identified, critically assessed, and compared over time. I focused on 2 rare instances of contention as my cases: the fiscal year 1994 NDAA and the fiscal 2024 NDAA. These periods have striking similarities in terms of the geopolitical and social environments, but at different legislative environments due to the rise of polarization. In both cases, I conclude that changing geopolitical environments that spark the motive, means, and opportunity for a critical reappraisal of U.S. grand strategy and defense policy aims also offers a window for policymakers to introduce social issues into the NDAA. In contrast, I find that deepening political polarization has heightened the degree to which these issues disrupt the progression of the NDAA through Congress. The end of the Cold War and the beginning of the unipolar moment in the early 1990s forced U.S. policymakers to grapple with the future direction of American defense policy. Some believe that the U.S. should take advantage of the reduced threat environment to scale back its global commitments and shrink the defense budget. Others argued that the U.S. should preserve or even expand its commitments because of this diminished environment. This critical juncture provided the opportunity for policymakers like President Bill Clinton to propose changes to the military's ban on sexual minorities, which would manifest during the 1994 NDAA. Similarly, the U.S. currently faces another critical juncture in its national defense. The unipolar moment has given way to an era of great power competition. The U.S. has shifted its attention to addressing the complex challenges posed by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. While many on the far right and progressive left favor an American defense policy based on restraint, others in the establishment wish to maintain a globally engaged U.S. grand strategy and defense apparatus. This window has given policymakers greater flexibility to introduce defense policy measures related to more contentious social issues, as was the case with abortion in the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization around the 2024 NDAA process. The factors enabling policymakers to introduce controversial social issues were very similar for both cases. However, the disruption caused by social issues was very different across the two cases, which I argue is a direct result of polarization. At the outset of the '94 process, it became clear that the Armed Services Committees were motivated to reduce the controversy by seeking a compromise. Congressional leadership, including Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Sam Nunn and Ranking Member Strom Thurmond, negotiated a deal with President Clinton to delay any policy changes until the DoD and Congress had conducted extensive reviews on the subject. Accordingly, the Armed Services Committees held a series of hearings featuring witnesses with varied backgrounds and perspectives, which offered chances for open discussion and finding common ground. The Armed Services Committees eventually reached the Don't Ask, Don't Tell compromise, which was adopted in the NDAA by both chambers with wide bipartisan support, and the NDAA was passed with minimal difficulty afterward. The members utilized the legislative process to help them reach a policy compromise, which insulated the process from the noticeable tension surrounding the issue. In contrast, members engaged in political warfare over abortion debates during the '24 process. After the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the DoD unilaterally and controversially changed its policies to facilitate easier abortion access to its service members at the behest of Democrats. This infuriated congressional Republicans, who asserted that this change violated the Hyde Amendment and usurped the congressional mandate over structural defense policy issues. This prompted Senator Joni Ernst and Congressman Ronnie Jackson to introduce amendments to the NDAA that would reverse this policy change. Although Ernst's amendment was defeated during markups, Jackson's was narrowly adopted by the slim Republican majority in the House, causing House Democrats to abandon the bill. This initiated a prolonged and chaotic conference process where neither side was willing to compromise on their demands for months. In December, though, Republican negotiators eventually dropped their abortion policy demands in order to reach a bipartisan agreement. The finalized NDAA survived two final challenges made by dissatisfied Republicans forcing a vote on the abortion issue before the bill was passed with days to spare. Instead of the culture of compromise that characterized the '94 process, members entered the '24 process seeking to secure policy victories on the abortion issue, intensifying the influence of contention on the process and nearly derailing the bill entirely. This thesis' findings have important implications. First, I found in my research only a handful of scholarly articles that engage with defense policy or the NDAA. This thesis addresses this lack of scholarship. I also found that scholars have failed to appreciate the growing impact of polarization on defense issues. Instead, I noted that both Democrats and Republicans employ techniques that threaten to significantly derail the 2024 NDAA in order to gain leverage. Second, I contend that the NDAA has become more vulnerable than ever. Legislative gridlock, political warfare, and the increased significance of national defense policy all nearly pushed the NDAA to the brink of collapse. This increasing pressure may cause the NDAA to become too big to fail, which should have disastrous ramifications for both the future of U.S. national defense policy and Congress if too many straws are added to the camel's back. Third, failing to pass the NDAA would prevent the U.S. from decisively shaping its defense policies in order to achieve the grand strategy of choice, whether it be restraint or engagement. It would signal to the international community that the U.S. is indecisive about its role in the world, which could further embolden American adversaries, worry our partners and allies, and complicate an already volatile geopolitical environment. This emphasizes the imperative for policymakers to maintain their commitment to passing the NDAA on time and annually. Finally, if the NDAA process is considered to be one of the last that closely resembles the Schoolhouse Rock legislative model, then disrupting the 6-decade tradition would serve as a damning indictment about the functionality of Congress and the health of representative democracy in America. This would further undermine the already low public and institutional trust in Congress. In order to avert these disastrous outcomes, members of Congress must look to the example set by those involved in the 1994 process and approach governance with a willingness to reach across the aisle and compromise, rather than engaging in political warfare. Thank you.
Okay, let's see.
Control L. Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. Despite being the 9th person to speak today and the 9th person to say a large thank you to my advisors, Professor Robert Hackey and Professor Anya Bassett, I do really mean it. Thank you so much for all your help during this process. The amount of time and effort both of you have put into making this project a success is something I will always be grateful for. So, without further ado, today I will be talking about the Harm Reduction Center pilot program that was passed here in Rhode Island in 2021. So a bit of context for people who may be newer to the field of drug policy. When people talk about harm reduction, they're referring to a philosophical outlook that has to do with dangerous behaviors like drug use and drinking alcohol. Harm reduction is about mitigating the secondary effects of these choices, like the spread of bloodborne pathogens, homelessness, and social exclusion, regardless of whether or not someone is able to give up these choices yet. It has become far more popular in the past 20 years with the onset of the opioid epidemic, and specifically fentanyl poisoning, which has killed thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people in the United States, including thousands of Rhode Islanders. It is because of this that in 2021, Rhode Island leaders passed the first state law in American history that allows for full-fledged harm reduction centers, where clinicians are able to watch over people taking illegal drugs. This would enable them to administer medications to prevent and treat overdoses. Within the United States context, this is a radical departure from past policy, but it does have international precedent. Hundreds of these harm reduction centers have operated since the 1980s in countries around the world, including Australia and Canada and Switzerland, and to date, not a single person has ever died of an overdose in one of these centers. So, fundamentally, what I was trying to understand is how a bill like this would ever pass in Rhode Island, given how the United States has traditionally handled drug policy. Passing social welfare legislation for stigmatized groups like illicit drug users is a historically difficult task, especially when there really isn't much of a political lobby for people suffering from substance use disorders. So what about the state of Rhode Island contributed to the bill's success? And what about our current moment in the opioid epidemic, specifically with the onset of fentanyl, also contributed? And zooming out from the specifics of this one state, what does this law and its ability to pass after decades of harm reduction centers operating in countries around the world say about the direction of our addiction policy and healthcare laws nationwide? So I went about answering this question in several stages. The first involved a deep dive into the state's past responses to stigmatized public health challenges and the history of harm reduction in Rhode Island as a movement that emerged to protect people from the spread of HIV in the 1980s. From there, I dove into the more recent history of harm reduction debates in the state. This included analyzing 6 years of transcript records from the governor's Overdose Prevention and Intervention Task Force. Next, I compiled every available testimony and document related to the debate of these bills, available through the State Library and the State Archives here in Providence. I also conducted a transcript analysis of these debates, which were available in the General Assembly's online archives. Last, I interviewed many of the figures chiefly involved with this bill, and these interviews in total reached 2 sponsors of the bill, 2 public health experts, 2 lobbyists for the bill, and 1 community-based healthcare worker. I asked these informants about the extent of their involvement with the bill's drafting and passage, why they believed Rhode Island to be the first state to pass this law, and some of the legal and political implications of this movement's success. One of the most exciting parts about this research was that the people that I interviewed told remarkably similar stories about what helped this bill pass. The factors that they mentioned were corroborated by themes that emerged in testimony and in reporting on the pilot program. The first factor that came up repeatedly was how public health leaders and physicians were the ones who wrote this bill and initiated this movement. Major figures from the American Medical Association, the Rhode Island Medical Society, and Brown Public Health successfully framed addiction treatment as a public health matter and supervised drug consumption as just a necessary part of the practice of medicine. Rhode Island's medical establishment has actually been a major player in recent years in advancing progressive policy and collaborating with the governor on brainstorming policy ideas to curb the opioid epidemic. The second essential factor that was mentioned was the critical mass of lawmakers who had personal experiences either with addiction or with the tragedy of overdose. Even lawmakers high up in the General Assembly ranks came forward to share their personal stories, to break down the stigma and help humanize drug users as people who they had known and loved. The last reason was definitely the most surprising to me, and the one that goes against traditional political theory the most starkly. And this was the concerted effort to hide the bill as it was making its way through the General Assembly to prevent an organized opposition from ever emerging. This was because the rise of fentanyl was viewed as such an acute crisis that the state simply did not have time for a protracted debate on this issue. So, what does this case teach us, both about passing legislation that will benefit stigmatized people like drug users and where this debate may be headed elsewhere? It is hard to emphasize enough how uncommon it is for some of the least politically empowered people to have, quote, inside access to covert political channels. That high-level officials went out of their way to approve a controversial, experimental policy like this is remarkable. It speaks to just how acute the fentanyl crisis has gotten in this state and how it has not spared any aspects or segments of the community. Another really unique aspect of this fight from a theory perspective has to do with what's called the social construction of target populations for welfare laws. Usually, to try to promote social protections like this one, advocates will try to show how deserving the relevant population of the support would be. And there was a very different argument made in this case. As opposed to bringing out children like Ryan White or Hydea Broadbent in comparison to the HIV crisis, people who testified about past addictions were quick to talk about the mistakes that they had made in their past, but maintained nonetheless that those faults shouldn't mean that they should have to die of an overdose. They were adamant that no one deserves to die a preventable death, no matter what their situation may be. As far as where this debate may be headed in other states, last year Minnesota became the second state to pass a law like Rhode Island's, allowing harm reduction centers, and New York has opened two as well. Nevertheless, this research points to a sort of mixed outcome for advocates, or a mixed prospects for advocates in other states. Obviously, the opioid crisis is by no means limited to Rhode Island, so one could expect all different states to have lawmakers with devastating stories about losing loved ones. On the other hand, with every new place that starts talking about harm reduction policies, it becomes harder and harder to hide an effort like this one. Regardless of whether a particular state's effort will be successful, this research does make clear the importance of bringing in professionals like emergency physicians and first responders who are able to talk credibly about the crisis and which policies like this one would be able to tangibly help their work. So I want to leave you all with a story that I include near the end of my thesis. Throughout this research, I have read and heard incredibly heartbreaking stories of loss that families have gone through due to overdose. But the one that stuck out to me the most was that of Jonathan Stampler, who was left for dead after an overdose in front of a Florida hospital by his drug dealer in 2003. Doctors were not able to save him, and he died after a week in a coma. His death exemplifies what a profound tragedy every overdose is. This is because it was his stepfather, Dr. Jack Fishman, who had developed and patented the miracle opioid overdose reversal drug naloxone 40 years prior. Their family knew, perhaps better than anyone else on earth, that he did not have to die. This research was rooted in the ideas that the solutions to problems like overdose and addiction are out there, and we have to ask ourselves what it takes from a policymaking perspective to overcome stigmas, learn from other contexts, and implement them. So I would like to thank my advisors, Professor Hackey and Professor Bassett, specifically one more time, for helping me to contribute, even in a small way, to understanding how this social learning happens. I do really appreciate it. Thank you.
Super embarrassing. Wow, these were great. And yeah, as I said, what an incredible joy to see these projects develop. So I'd like to start with the baton question. So you have now run with the baton for a whole year. And for juniors who are just starting your thesis projects, you can look at their prospectuses to see how far they have come. So where would you run next? Where would you, what would you do to kind of channel Susan Moffett a little bit if you had another year, or if you were handing the baton off to another scholar? What's the next step in understanding the broader topic or the specific case that you're looking at? Logan, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I would first like to say, I mentioned leveraging several different kind of streams of literature, literature on zoning policy and its effects on urban sprawl, emissions, literature on housing. There really isn't any existing literature on climate interest group behavior in this particular space. So I really see my thesis as kind of the start of a conversation. And I think if I were to continue this work going forward, I would look at other interest groups beyond the 4 that I sampled and conducted interviews with, particularly those that only operate on a state level. They might be more keyed into state level zoning policy debates, more interested in them, and might be more compelled to act there. So exploring that, and also exploring the new pieces of legislation that are continuously coming up. So Maine just passed a similar law to Oregon and California, which effectively abolishes single-family zoning. Montana also recently did the same. So exploring climate interest group behavior in those new settings as they emerge, I think is also something important.
I'd make 2 suggestions. The first is continue monitoring the trend of the impact of polarization on defense issues, right? The NDAA, the abortion debates were kind of reached an unsteady conclusion, an unstable conclusion towards the end of the process because it was just merely omitted. I would be interested to see more research on whether or not this trend continues, especially upcoming election cycles where power may change hands in the executive or the legislative, or maybe we even see judicial challenges to it. So that's kind of the first area. The second area is the authorization process is one half of the coin. Authorization authorizes the appropriations legislation and for the actual money to go to the Department of Defense and different federal agencies. I'd be very interested to see if we kind of see a similar trend with defense appropriations legislation, right? If social issues or polarization has impacted that process. We've already seen this fiscal year a lot of the appropriations legislation being significantly delayed. And I'd be interested to see what impact that's had on our national defense.
Yeah, I think similarly, I had 2 questions kind of as follow-ups that I would be really interested to explore in more depth. The first and most obvious would be kind of a similar examination of what has happened in the past couple years in Minnesota. So as I mentioned, in 2023, Minnesota became the 2nd state to pass a law like Rhode Island's, but the debate actually looked very different. In Rhode Island, kind of the drafters of the bill went to very painstaking lengths to make it an easy bill to support. They passed off the implementation of the law and the appropriations for it to external organizations and brought in as much help from kind of public health leaders and medical professionals as they could. In Minnesota, there was not kind of the similar amount of couching what the bill was about. It was pretty straightforward. There was even kind of something on one of the Minnesota Secretary of Health and Human Services website that was interesting, where there was a Q&A and they were pretty forthcoming by saying this is going to cost the state $3 million to $10 million a year. I forget what the exact number was, but they were much more forward. And given kind of the political dynamics in a state that is so heavily Democratic like Rhode Island necessitated kind of what I would, call a little bit of obfuscation, I'm interested how the Minnesota law passed. The second would be a closer look at states that were even harder hit by the opioid epidemic than Rhode Island, despite Rhode Island being one of the top states. Specifically some in the Southeast and Appalachia that are less controlled by one party. Most of my project had to do with intra-Democratic Party politics because Rhode Island has 87% of their seats as Democrats in the years that I was studying, so kind of how they spoke to each other was of much more consequence than how Democrats and Republicans interacted with each other. I also think that there's a kind of disconnect between demand-side policies that are typically thought of as harm reduction and kind of the supply-side things that Republicans usually talk about when they're speaking about the drug crisis in the United States. Usually you'll hear things about border politics or harsher sentencing against drug dealers, but these policies don't really have much to do with how society should treat people suffering from substance use disorders. So it's interesting that the debate happens on different terms as opposed to just disagreements. So I think study of that would be very interesting.
Terrific. Questions from the audience? Yes, Michelle.
Really phenomenal presentations, all three of you. I was particularly interested in yours, William, and your analysis of the politics behind the passage of a program with limited domestic precedent. And I am particularly interested, right, because Rhode Island has a part-time legislature, so that makes it even harder to pass policy. And I'm curious, in your analysis of the politics of leadership within the legislature, did you find that there was impact because we had maybe staunch supporters within leadership in the Rhode Island legislature that were able to move the legislation forward, and to what extent that had an impact on the passage of the legislation itself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. It's hard to say exactly which comes first, that there were high-level supporters or that the bill kind of had a lot of support. But I will say that it was really surprising both how many people who are high up in the state's government, from the chairs of committees that were relevant, the Health and Human Services committees, people in the Attorney General's office, people in the Department of Health, that came forward to either get involved with this bill or were very careful to not stand in its way. And that definitely allowed it a simpler, and what one state representative called it, a faster passage than most other bills that take several cycles to get through. So one of the examples of that was this bill went through the Health and Human Services Committee, and both of the chairs of that committee are high-ranking Democrats who were very in support of this bill. One, interestingly, is a conservative Democrat by most other kind of factors that you could speak about that. But as he was a first responder, kind of did an interview where he was talking about, I've gone into enough houses where people have overdosed and we couldn't get there in time, and I just couldn't, under kind of the crisis that we're experiencing, I couldn't allow this to go on any longer. So kind of having that high-level support, I think, was incredibly helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again.
Professor Allen.
You know, it strikes me too, William, that it had a lot of grassroots support as well. Just, I would imagine, in parents and relatives who have experienced that within their family. So I think your points about critical mass, I think, are very important. But across the board, I think both leadership and, it seemed to me, the grassroots were a major factor. Would you agree with that?
I would actually disagree with that. I think that was part of the effort to hide the bill as it was going through the General Assembly, was not mobilizing kind of people to do public protests and get involved. There was a team of a few lobbyists, and you can count them all on one hand, and there was very little reporting on the subject. There was very little mobilization in support of it, and I think that they viewed that as critical.
Do you think some of the legislators in leadership and elsewhere were hearing from their constituency as a concern? Would that be part of a more, if you will, informal grassroots effort?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I think it was also true that they had heard from their colleagues. So it definitely came from lots of different levels. I mean, one state legislator spoke about specifically how she ran for state office in the first place because of a death that had happened in her family. So a lot of the people who, this experience was so widespread, I am almost curious to what extent they needed to hear from people in their constituencies about this to realize that this is such a massive issue. But I imagine that they did very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd love to get some questions for Ethan and Logan. Professor Levitas.
Yeah. Logan, I wasn't sure that the implication was that all the conservationist groups are now accepted high-density housing as a single important. Is that so? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I definitely don't think that's the case. There has historically been a split, different schools of thinking about environmental conservation. One school of thinking is more focused on the emission standpoint and realizing that denser housing and reducing sprawl is necessary to help curb emissions, and then there's another school of thought that thinks just generally development in general and the pollution that causes is negative, and that just any sort of additional development should be, reconsidered. That gap has narrowed. There's kind of more people on the side of recognizing denser housing as a useful necessity and beneficial to the climate, but that gap is certainly still there.
Has Sierra moved substantially from one extreme to the other, or is that?
I would say so. Through my interviews, really it seemed to be the turning point was 2020 in the wake of George Floyd's killing. They had a massive reevaluation of their internal priorities, dedicated new resources to environmental justice, and part of that is also addressing some housing concerns as well.
But a social issue pushed them on the environmental density is good. Is that what, and that's kind of, okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Ethan, I'm wondering, it's a feature of American federalism that the federal government often tries to push through inclusive policy where it can first, starting with, the integration, non-integration of the Army, and so on. So, these issues have, pushing policy forward through the defense budget from the Democrat side has always been there, and I'm wondering whether this dance has a longer history than the last two issues, and what distinguishes.
Yeah, that's a good question, especially the integration aspect. The scope of my thesis looked at social issues addressed by the NDAA. The NDAA was first enacted in 1962. It was the brainchild of Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Richard Russell. And then it kind of started as this really tiny, one-page long kind of defense, very minuscule thing, and now it's thousands of pages and billions upon billions of dollars. So I would argue that, I would just kind of say that it kind of fell out of the scope of this thesis. But it's definitely true that, especially with growing polarization, you're seeing both parties trying to impact social change and social policies through different means. And the NDAA has become this kind of massive omnibus must-pass bill, and kind of given the changing geopolitical environment and given this renewed debate on what the American role should be, it's invited these issues to kind of take root in matters of defense more easily, as opposed to kind of other areas of policy and governance.
Question from Superman back here.
Oh, yeah.
Hello. I've got two light questions, one for Logan, one for Ethan. For Logan, what I may have just entirely missed it, but what drove the choice behind those four legislative picks?
Sure. So,
and, to what extent do you think the conclusion may have changed in looking at other districts with less popular support for combating climate change? And then for Ethan, to what extent does geopolitical instability, did you see any trend with that and impact on the progress of I can't remember the acronym, NDAA?
NDAA. It's like the American Dodgeball Association of America from Dodgeball, if that helps you remember it.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question. So bill choice was largely a result of a small sample size. These kinds of bills were only, started to be passed in maybe around 2018 and have increasingly come up. So there's already a pretty small set of bills to choose from. But in terms of narrowing things down, I looked at bills only that were considered in predominantly Democratic states, because that's just where a majority of these bills cropped up. And then also, I wanted to compare somewhat analogous bills to each other. So I compared Massachusetts and Connecticut, which introduced similar transit-oriented development bills, and Oregon and California, because they also introduced some sort of kind of similar restrictions on single-family zoning. So that was kind of the main motivation for choices.
So I'd say, I don't know if it's geopolitical instability, but more kind of obscurity and change, and as to how American policymakers and practitioners envision our role in the world, right? I kind of looked at the end of the Cold War, right? You have the end of history that Professor Bassett talked about earlier, and the fall of the Soviet Union being this really kind of watershed moment. Like I referenced the speech given by Wolfowitz saying, I don't know what the hell to do now that the Soviet Union's done, right? That's been our policy since the 1940s. And then similarly now we're kind of thinking about, all right, we've done some work on the global war on terror. We've been in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now we kind of see great power competition with Russia and China as kind of the pressing order of the day. How do we best kind of adjust our defense forces and our national defense apparatus to address these changes? There was one other case that I considered including, which was the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the 2010. It was the 2011 NDAA. But I omitted it because we were kind of ensconced in the war on terror. And I found that it wasn't a time of geopolitical change, but we were kind of entrenched in this war in Afghanistan. So if that kind of answers your question.
Yes, Teamboat. Steamboat. Sorry. I didn't see the S.
Great presentations, all of you. I have a question for Will. You mentioned that there was international precedent for these kinds of harm reduction centers, and I'm curious how the legislation process for those compares to Rhode Island, and also how that might inform future research, like you mentioned, for maybe less transparent cases like Minnesota.
Yes. I will admit that I have not done much research on the legislative processes that have happened in other countries, but I think Canada's experience has been very interesting because they have such a long history with this in so many different contexts that they've been able to answer a lot of kind of the tricky implementation questions that come up in Rhode Island. So they've dealt with kind of how you get somewhere that's transit accessible but also not residential, so that people are able to access medical care, but it's not like a neighborhood kind of concern. And they've had successful and unsuccessful iterations of that process. One of the things that I think is the most direct implementation of kind of international experience to Rhode Island's case has to do with a professor of public health here at Brown who is from Vancouver and has been a really, really staunch advocate of harm reduction policies, seeing how they've worked in his home community, and has had a lot of success lobbying the state government to directly kind of repurpose the city of Vancouver's policies and approaches and use them in Rhode Island. So I think that's definitely the best example.
All right, oh yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for Mr. Minkoff. So this year we saw some individual legislators break from their party on some issues. I'm thinking specifically Senator Tuberville. Do you think the NDAA is going to become a place where we see more inter-party sort of competition and more cleavages form because of how important it is and because of how you can jam social issues into it?
I'd say we're kind of seeing a trend where legislators are very much sticking to the party line. Something I read about in my thesis is when polarization becomes greater, there's kind of a need for, like, legislators would like stronger leadership, right? That's something we're seeing in the House in the 118th Congress, right? Congressman Matt Gaetz removed Speaker Kevin McCarthy. They install Speaker Johnson, and then now Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene wants to remove Speaker Johnson because she doesn't think he's being too hardline enough on a lot of these issues. So I'd argue that it's becoming increasingly rare for people to break the party line. It's kind of like, all right, if you're a young legislator or you're kind of in maybe not a high-profile person, your responsibility is to kind of keep your mouth shut and stay within the caucus, right? In that second challenge where Senator Ernst tried to force a vote on the abortion issue, only 2 Republicans defected. It was Senators Murkowski from Alaska and Senator Collins from Maine, who are considered 2 of the most moderate. So we're kind of seeing the death of the moderate in Congress, and as a result, more legislators are staying with the party and not breaking from the party.
All right, I'll ask the last question, moderator's privilege of Logan. So I'm wondering if you could, I asked Emery and Lizzie about hope. So suppose you are a environmental advocate or a housing advocate and you're trying to build a coalition. How would you approach the other party, and how would you, what is the lessons from your thesis? Tell us about the capacity of progressive activists to work together towards common goals.
Yeah, I think there's a couple bright spots. One I think is one I encountered in my interviews with climate interest groups, and pretty much all of them are intimately familiar with the benefits of these zoning reforms on the climate. They understand them very well, which is no small feat considering how obscure zoning is and how kind of indirectly this is related to the climate. So that was very encouraging to see. And in terms of building coalition, I think it really does have to start with the housing activists. That's something that happened in Connecticut. The bill that was offered there was kind of the brainchild of a housing coalition, which actually incorporated several environmental groups like the Sierra Club who were members. So I think it really has to come from housing groups leading the charge and seeking to build coalition with climate interest groups. But also, climate interest groups can actively seek out coalition with housing groups who are engaged in these spaces as well, so that they can work alongside them without necessarily having to do all the legwork on this kind of housing policy.
Excellent. What a wonderful panel. Thank you. And now I'd like to welcome Ed Steinfeld up to the podium to give closing remarks, and then we have a reception, note free food outside. I'm exchanging.
Okay.
You are not me.
Thank you. Thanks, Anya. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. I know we're only partway through this conference. We have another set of panels tomorrow. But for me, this is my 9th such conference. This is such a glorious event at such a glorious time of year. And I just wanted to say a few words about why I think it's so glorious. So first, a number of the students who presented today I've had in class, actually many of them, and I interact with them in a number of other fora as well. So I don't really need the conference today to know that these students are brilliant and exceptional. But to see the students emerge as true experts, real experts, and to see them emerge as experts in a position to teach me, to teach all of us, that just feels great. It feels like the appropriate cycle of the way things should work, but it's just so wonderful to see it actually happen. The second thing, I really appreciate the humility that this particular kind of expertise and these particular experts bring to their work. I think every one of the presentations acknowledged implicitly or explicitly, and they were encouraged to do so, I think, by questions about batons, and that this work it's a continuing effort and a continuous effort in many ways to deal with very challenging and very important societal problems. And I think all of these experts recognize that they've achieved a very high level of work and have delivered a series of answers to us, but by no means are these the final answers. They've allowed us to continue to the investigations in our own work. They will undoubtedly, no matter what they do, whether it's in academia, outside of academia, they too will continue this exploration, whether of these particular issues or others. And that too gives me a great deal of hope at a time when, it's sometimes a little hard to be hopeful. Just a third element, it's really all of you in the audience. I love to see a packed room. And what that packed room says to me, and it's not just on this glorious day and tomorrow, but it's on many occasions we have, what this packed room says to me and affirms for me is that scholarship, and even beyond scholarship, the solving of big societal problems, it's a social endeavor. It's one that involves many different contributors in many different kinds of capacities. We have friends in the room and advisors, family members. It's more than just gratifying to see that. It's really uplifting. And again, to me, it's a source of great hope and great optimism
for the future. Many things we do here at Brown, here at Watson, do involve community efforts. I think pretty much everything we do involves community efforts, and it involves the efforts of teams. And so just on that note about the effort of the team, I want to end my own remarks now and turn things over with great anticipation of what's going to happen tomorrow with additional presentations, but I want to turn things over to a few of our students who are going to make a thank you presentation of their own.
So today is a celebration of student work, as is tomorrow. But there's so many humans who are behind the scenes who've done a lot to support this tremendous research that you've seen today, and are really the backbone of the operation of our undergraduate concentration in IAPA. So today we want to say a special thank you with our Watson red tulips, notice the red, to Anya Bassett, Claudia Elliott, Anita Nestor, and Sandy Soares. Can we give
Super. Thank you to our really exceptional IAPA team. And with that, I invite you all to continue tomorrow with additional presentations and immediately to join us outside for some refreshments. Thanks, everybody.